Chapter 1. Prophecy of Doom. The Great Temple of Xoltan, Lustria. The vast chamber of the Great Pyramid of Xoltan was bathed in an eerie luminescence, the air thick with the heavy scent of sacred incense. The ancient glyphs and golden reliefs of the old ones adorned every surface, pulsating faintly with a power as old as the stars. Thick vines, slick with humidity, clung to the weathered stone walls, curling around the mighty pillars that held up the immense, impossibly high ceiling. Beyond the temple, the jungle teemed with life, serpentine roars, the distant crashing of great beasts, and the perpetual hum of insects. But within the temple's sanctum, all was still. Slann Mage-Priest Xol'taq sat atop his hovering stone throne, his bloated amphibian body held in perfect stillness. His ancient flesh was covered in deep cracks. His once vibrant skin faded to a withered hue. He had not moved in over a century, not even to blink. His three-lobed eyes stared unseeing into the void, his mind adrift in the great cosmic sea of time and fate. Then the silence shattered. Xol'taq's entire form convulsed violently, his great jowled mouth snapping open as a guttural croak of pain escaped him. His eyes rolled back, and his mind was ripped from the tranquil void and hurled into a seething maelstrom of visions. The prophecy unfolds. He saw a city lost in time, swallowed by shifting sands and broken by war. Massive stone obelisks, inscribed with the sacred glyphs of the old ones, stood cracked and crumbling beneath a sky bleeding fire. The air itself seemed wrong, vibrating with sickening whispers that slithered into the mind like worms burrowing into flesh. At the city's heart, a monolithic temple, black as the void between stars, rose like a malignant growth. Atop it, suspended in crackling energy, was the Ouroboros of Eternity, a colossal golden ring inscribed with the sacred serpent glyph of Tepak, spinning slowly as if caught in the throes of some dark incantation. Xol'taq's mind recoiled as a figure emerged from the darkness. A demon prince, towering, grotesque, a thing of living madness and corruption. Its body was ever-shifting, one moment a hulking warrior clad in baroque spiked armor, the next a serpentine horror, its limbs replaced by chittering, multi-jointed appendages tipped with razored talons. Its eyes burned with malice, and from its gaping maw a choir of 1,000 voices screamed in agony and triumph. The demon reached out, and as its clawed hand closed around the Ouroboros, the air tore apart like rotted flesh, revealing a vortex of pure chaos. The sky turned to liquid fire, and the land itself writhed like a living thing, birthing horrors that should not be. He saw temple cities burning, their stone walls crumbling as daemonic legions surged forth. He saw Sorcerer warriors, noble and proud, fighting a losing battle, their blood soaking the sacred ground of Lustria. He saw the Slan falling, their ancient power devoured by the endless hunger of the warp. And then he saw the world itself shatter, breaking apart like a brittle eggshell, and beyond it only the infinite, screaming void. The awakening. With a thunderous crack, Xol'taq was yanked back into his body. His bulbous form jerked violently, his limbs spasming, his throne shaking with the force of his return. A sharp flash of azure energy surged through the temple, causing the golden reliefs of the old ones to glow blindingly bright for a moment before fading. The chamber reverberated with psychic shockwaves, sending ripples through the very fabric of reality. Outside, the jungle howled in response, the distant bellows of carnosaurs mixing with the shrieks of terror birds, as if the entire land itself felt the disturbance. At the foot of the temple's great staircase, a group of Sorcerer temple guards, hulking reptilian warriors clad in heavy gold-plated armor, reacted immediately, gripping their great obsidian-tipped halberds and assuming a defensive stance. Their slitted eyes darted to the sacred chamber, their battle-honed instincts sensing that something unnatural had transpired. From the shadows, Chaku, a skink priest, emerged, his diminutive form dwarfed by the hulking warriors around him. His feathered headdress marked him as a servant of the Slan, his ceremonial staff pulsing with residual magic. He hesitated only a moment before ascending the temple steps. Xoltaq's gargantuan form trembled, his three-lobed eyes flickering open, each orb swirling with celestial energies. His breath came in deep, rasping croaks, the weight of the vision pressing down upon his very soul. Chaku fell to his knees, his voice trembling as he spoke in the hissing language of the Lizardmen. "What has been seen, Great One?" For the first time in centuries, Xol'taq spoke aloud, his voice like the grinding of stone and the whisper of the void. Doom. A silence followed, heavy and oppressive. Then, with effort, the Mage-Priest continued, his words sending an icy dread through the chamber. "The Ouroboros of Eternity, it is waking. If it falls into the hands of chaos, all shall end." Chaku felt his blood chill. He had studied the sacred glyphs of the Old Ones for decades, but even he knew little of the Ouroboros, a relic of immeasurable power, lost long before even the great wars of the past. Its purpose unknown, its existence myth. Until now. The Mage-Priest slowly turned his head, his vast, unmoving gaze fixing upon the Skink Priest. "Summon the Warband. The will of the Old Ones must be done." Chaku hesitated only a moment before bowing low, his snout brushing the sacred stones. "As you command, Great One." He rose swiftly and turned, his clawed feet pattering across the stone floor as he vanished into the temple's depths. Xol'taq exhaled slowly, his eyes drifting shut again, though his mind no longer sought the deep slumber of ages. No, there would be no rest now. The prophecy had spoken, and doom was coming. Chapter 2. The Warband Chosen. The Sacred Pools of Xoltan, Lustria. The great temple of Xoltan was alive with purpose. Below the towering pyramid, within the jungle-choked ruins of the old city, skink attendants scurried like insects, their voices a flurry of hissing commands, as warriors were roused from their barracks and sacred offerings were placed upon golden altars. The jungle, vast and untamed, pulsed with a primal energy, as if it too had sensed the impending storm of fate. At the foot of the temple, beneath the watchful eyes of stone-carved gods, 5 warriors stood, summoned by the will of the Mage-Priest Xol'taq. Each was a living weapon, a chosen champion of the Lizardmen race. Each would die before allowing the Old One's will to be denied. The chosen of Xol'taq. Tetzuk the Saurus Oldblood. Tetzuk stood motionless, his colossal form carved from muscle and scarred scales. His skin was a patchwork of old wounds and jagged marks, each telling the story of battles fought and won. Across his broad chest, deep scars ran like ancient rivers, proof of battles against demons, men, and the spawn of the dark gods. His blackened war crest, ridged and sharp, framed a face of pure savagery. His fangs, yellowed from years of bloodshed, clicked together instinctively as his slitted eyes surveyed the temple grounds. He carried a great obsidian-bladed maku, its edges stained a dark, near-permanent red. The weapon was old, older than most empires, forged from a sacred relic of the Old Ones, passed down through the line of warlords before him. He did not question why he had been summoned. Tetzuk was born to kill, to rip, to tear, to butcher in the name of the Old Ones. He would see this mission done. Chaku, the Skink Priest. Standing beside the towering Saurus, Chaku was small in comparison but no less dangerous. His mind, sharpened by the study of celestial prophecy, burned with the arcane whispers of the Old Ones. His frilled headdress, adorned with golden charms, swayed slightly in the humid air, and his 3-clawed hands gripped a staff topped with a glowing emerald orb. His role was clear: to interpret Xol'taq's will, to divine the path forward through the shifting sands of fate. He had seen the visions of chaos, the great screaming vortex of horror that would consume them if they failed. He had seen the death of Lustria, its sacred temples drowned in the filth of the warp. He would not allow it to come to pass. Huan Chi's shadow, the chameleon skink. A whisper of movement, and Huan Chi's shadow emerged from the darkness. He was a phantom, a creature of the wild, never fully seen, never fully known. His scales shimmered, blending perfectly with his surroundings, as if the very jungle itself had willed him into existence. His golden eye rings marked him as one of Huan Chi's chosen hunters, a servant of the jaguar god of stealth. Strapped to his back was a blowpipe, the darts coated in venom so potent that even a single scratch could send a fully grown chaos marauder into spasming death within moments. Huan Chi's shadow spoke rarely, his voice a low, rasping whisper, but he did not need words. He was death unseen, the silent executioner, and there would be many heads to claim before their mission was done. Grok Kai, the Kroxigor. A low growl, a sound like thunder rumbling in the depths of the earth, reverberated through the temple grounds. Crow Kai towered above them all, his reptilian bulk a fortress of raw, brutal muscle. His fanged maw, wide enough to crush a man's skull in a single bite, dripped with anticipation. His massive two-handed maul, crafted from the bones of a slain carnosaur, rested upon one shoulder. He had not been chosen for his mind. He had been chosen for his ability to destroy, to break, to shatter, to pulverize flesh and bone into nothing but a pulp of gore and ruin. He would serve, as he always had, as the unstoppable force of the Old One's wrath. Zanchai, the skink star priest. The last to arrive was Zenchai, the most mystical among them. His skin, painted with celestial sigils, glowed faintly under the moon's light. His golden eyes, flecked with eerie blue markings, spoke of one who had seen beyond the veil, who had peered into the depths of the cosmos and survived the madness within. He carried no blade. His weapon was the unseen, the power of the stars, the force of the heavens themselves. It was said that Zanchai had walked among the spirits of the Slan, that his mind could touch the realms beyond reality. He would be their guide into the supernatural, their shield against the madness of the warp. It would see them through the trials to come. The mission revealed. A deep thrum resonated through the temple as Xol'taq's floating throne descended. The air rippled with raw psychic energy, the very ground trembling beneath the weight of his power. The Warband fell silent, their reptilian eyes locked onto their ancient master. Xol'taq spoke, his words echoing not just in the temple, but within their minds, hammering into their skulls like celestial fire. The Ouroboros has awakened. Chaos seeks to claim it. You will retrieve it or perish. His eyes blazed with the light of eternity, and for a moment the Warband saw the vision of doom as he had seen it. A world consumed in the roiling darkness of the warp, lizardmen burning beneath demonic claws, the stars themselves snuffed out. Tetzok snarled, his claws tightening around his obsidian blade. Chaku clutched his staff, his mind racing with the burden of prophecy. Huan Chi's shadow vanished once more, merging with the gloom. Krukai exhaled slowly, his thick fingers flexing in eager anticipation of the bloodshed to come. Zanchai sighed, his golden eyes gazing toward the sky, reading the shifting constellations for what was to come. The path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They would not fail, because if they did, there would be no world left to return to. Chapter 3. The Journey Begins. The Great Docks of Xoltan, Lustria. The air was thick with the heavy scent of brine and the distant decay of seaweed, carried on the humid breeze from the churning black waves beyond the jungle shores. Massive stone docks, half swallowed by vines, stood in the shadow of colossal Old One statues, their faces weathered by millennia of rain and wind. Great stepped piers carved with ancient glyphs stretched out into the sea like the arms of some long-dead god, reaching toward the horizon. The Warbands stood silent, their eyes fixed on the vessel that would bear them toward destiny. It was an ancient war galley, its hull carved from sacred jungle wood, reinforced with plates of gold and bronze. Glyphs of protection, etched by skink priests long before any living creature could remember, glowed faintly in the darkness. At its prow, a massive carved effigy of a Quatl, its gemstone eyes gleaming, seemed to watch the waves, as if warding away the horrors of the deep. A dozen skink sailors darted across the deck, their movements quick and precise as they prepared the ship for departure. Below, a handful of hulking Kroxigors, their arms thick as tree trunks, worked the massive oars, their low, rumbling growls vibrating through the wooden planks. Xol'taq had already retreated into his meditative slumber, his bloated form seated upon his hovering stone throne, deep within the hold, his mind drifting through the astral currents, seeking guidance from the stars. His presence was absolute, yet he had given no further orders. The Warband knew their purpose, and so without ceremony they boarded. Their journey to the old world had begun. The dangers of the deep. The war galley sliced through the waves like a silent hunter, its golden sails catching the wind. The sea stretched endless and dark before them, the waters shifting from an eerie emerald green near the Lustrian coast to a deep abyssal black as they ventured further into the unknown. For weeks, the Warband saw nothing but water, a vast, indifferent void, uncaring to the mission of the Old Ones. The days bled together, the sun a relentless, burning eye in the sky, while the nights brought only cold silence and the eerie echo of distant waves crashing against unseen shores. Then, on the 16th night, the ocean changed. The winds died without warning. The waves stilled, as if something vast and unseen had settled just beneath them. A thick mist, the color of rotting flesh, began to creep across the deck, coiling around the mast like a serpent of the deep. The air grew wrong, heavy with the stench of something foul, something unnatural. Wanchi's shadow, ever the keen observer, hissed in warning. His golden eyes narrowed, and his scales darkened instinctively, vanishing into the gloom. A sound rose from the depths, a wet, gurgling chuckle, like the death rattle of a drowning man, and then the ocean exploded. The spawn of the abyss. A colossal shape burst from the water, sending waves crashing over the deck. The ship lurched violently, the great stone effigy at its prow cracking under the impact. It was a thing of nightmares, a monstrous sea spawn, birthed from the deepest, blackest abyss. Its body was a rotting amalgamation of scaled flesh and bloated, malformed limbs, its glistening skin covered in tumors and writhing parasites. Its eyes, if they could be called such, were sunken, glowing pits of abyssal light, and from its gaping maw rows upon rows of jagged, needle-like fangs dripped with black ichor. The skink screamed as the beast's massive tentacle lashed out, wrapping around one of them, lifting him high into the air. He thrashed, his limbs flailing wildly, his eyes bulging in horror. Then, with a sickening crack, the tentacle crushed him like an overripe fruit, his body bursting apart in a spray of blood and bone. Tetzik reacted instantly, bellowing a war cry that shook the heavens. He lunged, his Muquatl flashing, and with one titanic swing, he severed a tentacle from the beast's body. The limb slammed onto the deck, twitching, its flesh sizzling as black ichor oozed from the wound, burning through the wood like acid. Drokai charged, his great maul raised high and brought it down with the force of an earthquake onto the creature's massive skull. The impact split open a section of its cranium, revealing a pulsing, gelatinous mass of brain and writhing parasites. But still the horror did not die. Instead, it screeched. a sound of infinite suffering, and lashed out once more, sending skinks hurtling into the sea. Zanshai raised his hands, his eyes glowing with celestial power. He uttered an incantation older than the sun, and from the heavens a bolt of pure cosmic energy struck the beast's exposed skull, incinerating flesh, bone, and corruption alike. The creature convulsed violently, its massive body thrashing, the sea boiling beneath it from the sheer power of the arcane blast. With one last, agonized wail, it collapsed, its bloated corpse sinking back into the abyss, leaving nothing but black, oil-slicked blood staining the waters. The battle was over. The Warband stood bloodied, panting, their weapons still dripping with the monstrosity's foul essence. The ocean remained silent, as if daring them to continue. And so they did. The old world beckons. Days passed, and the sea remained restless. Though the beast was slain, the taint of chaos still lingered in the air, an unseen hand watching from the shadows, waiting for the moment to strike again. Then, on the 25th dawn, land rose from the horizon. A dark coastline, jagged cliffs rising like the teeth of some ancient beast, silhouetted against the storm-laden sky. Beyond it, the sprawling, mist-choked lands of the old world awaited, hiding secrets older than men, older than elves. But Xol'taq had foreseen what must come next. Somewhere in these foreign lands, hidden among the ruins of empires long forgotten, lay the maps they needed, the key to navigating the chaos wastes, to finding the Ouroboros of Eternity before it was too late. As the ship neared the shore, Xol'taq tightened his grip on his weapon. Chaku whispered a prayer to the Old Ones. Guanchi's shadow disappeared into the mist. Krokai growled, his massive fists clenching in anticipation. Zanshai looked to the storm-choked sky, reading the signs in the stars. The journey had only just begun, and the war for the Ouroboros was far from over. Chapter 4. Sigmarite Resistance. The docks of Marienburg, the Old World. The war galley cut through the fog-choked waters of the Rake estuary, its golden sails now lowered, its hull scarred from weeks of battle, storms, and relentless tides. The ship moved silently, barely making a ripple as it glided into the misty harbor, its sacred glyphs dim to avoid unwanted attention. The air was foul, a mixture of rotting fish, spilled ale, and human filth. The docks of Marienburg, the wealthiest trading hub in the Old World, were as wretched as they were prosperous. Beneath the towering spires and grand merchant halls, narrow alleys choked with refuse ran like diseased veins through the heart of the city. Above, seagulls circled lazily, their harsh cries occasionally drowned out by the shouts of dock workers unloading their cargo, the ever-present clink of coin, and the distant tolling of a Sigmarite chapel bell. From the shadows of the galley's hold, the Warband emerged. They did not belong here. Xol'taq, his massive saurus frame draped in a heavy cloak, exuded nothing but brutal menace, his reptilian eyes narrowed as he surveyed the city. Cha, hunched low beneath his hood, clutched his staff tightly, feeling the lingering stench of human sorcery everywhere. Guanchi's shadow was already gone, having vanished into the fog to scout ahead. Krokai, the towering Kroxaker, was the biggest concern. No cloak would hide his immense bulk, so he remained in the galley's hold, waiting for the first sign of trouble. Zanshai, his golden eyes scanning the skyline, read the celestial patterns and frowned. This place stinks of human gods, and something else. He wasn't wrong. The moment they stepped onto the dock, they felt it. Eyes upon them, whispering voices carried by the wind. The humans nearby stiffened, some moving away cautiously, others making the sign of the twin-tailed comet. Xol'taq rumbled low in his throat. They know. Then the bells rang again, this time in rapid succession. In alarm, a voice bellowed across the dockyard. "Monsters! In the name of Sigmar, purge the abominations. The witch hunters attack. A group of black-clad warriors surged forth from the alleys, Sigmarite witch hunters, their long coats billowing, the runes of the God King carved into their armor. At their front stood a grizzled war priest, his head shaved, a massive warhammer gripped in both hands, his armor scorched with sacred sigils. By the light of Sigmar, burn these lizards back to the hell that spawned them. Gunfire erupted. The crack of black powder pistols filled the air as silver-tipped bullets whistled through the fog. One shot grazed Tetzuk's thick hide, drawing a thin trail of dark, steaming blood. Another buried itself harmlessly into Krokai's thick shoulder scales, causing the massive Kroxager to let out a bellowing snarl of rage. A torch was thrown, shattering against the galley's hull. Flames licked at the wood, their eerie glow reflecting in Tetz's murderous gaze. He was done hiding. With a thunderous roar, he charged. The first witch hunter barely had time to react before Tetzuk's Macuetal split his skull open, his face vanishing into a spray of crimson and shattered bone. A second hunter lunged with a silvered blade, slashing across Tetzuk's side, only for the old blood to grab him by the throat, lifting him high, his claws crushing the man's windpipe with effortless strength, before hurling the corpse into a pile of crates. Chaku lifted his staff, muttering ancient incantations. A ball of sizzling green energy formed in his palm, then erupted toward the attackers, striking one hunter dead center. The man screamed as his flesh melted away, his bones turning to charred ash before he crumpled into a pile of blackened ruin. The Warpers howled in fury, raising his warhammer high, the symbol of Sigmar glowing white, hot. "Filth! You shall not defile this holy place. Sigmar's wrath will cleanse you." With unnatural speed, he lunged at Krokai, his blessed hammer smashing into the Kroxagor's chest, sending the massive brute stumbling back, cracking ribs beneath the enchanted force of the strike. But Krokai did not fall. Instead, he grinned, a deep guttural growl escaping his throat. With one hand he grabbed the priest's arm mid-swing, holding him locked in place. With the other, he swung his massive maul, caving in the man's ribcage with a wet, sickening crunch. The priest's body convulsed violently, blood erupting from his mouth in thick gouts before he collapsed, twitching. The remaining hunters faltered. Seeing their leader reduced to a broken corpse, they hesitated, fear creeping into their eyes. That was all Huanqi's shadow needed. From the fog, a whisper of death. One hunter gurgled, clutching his throat as a poisoned dart buried deep into his jugular, his body convulsing violently before he collapsed, his veins turning black. Another turned, only to feel cold steel slip between his ribs. Huanqi's dagger piercing his heart before he even knew he was dying. Panic set in. "Fall back, fall back." The remaining hunters broke ranks, their faith wavering, fleeing into the city streets. The Warbands stood victorious, but the distant sound of clanking armor and booming war horns signaled what was to come. Reinforcement. Hundreds of them. "We must leave, now," Zanchai hissed. Chaku turned toward a nearby sewer grate, its iron bars rusted and loose. He gestured sharply. "Into the tunnels, now." Tetzuk growled in frustration, his blood still boiling, but he knew they could not fight an entire city. With one last glare at the human corpses, he turned and descended into the darkness below. One by one, the warband vanished into the sewers, the stench of rot and filth clinging to them like a curse. Above, the Sigmarite war horns sounded again, calling the city to arms against the monsters in their midst. The hunt had begun, but the warband was not prey. They were the Old One's chosen killers. And soon, Marienburg would learn that lesson in blood. Chapter 5. Alliance of Necessity. The underbelly of Marienburg. The sewers. The stench of death and rot clung to the air like an unshakable disease. The warband moved through the filthy tunnels, their steps splashing in the thick, festering sludge that coated the ground. The walls, ancient and crumbling, bore the marks of centuries of decay, deep gouges from rats the size of dogs, sigils carved by cultists long dead, and dark smears of something long congealed into an unnatural black crust. Above them, human boots clattered, voices barking orders in harsh, clipped Reichsspiel. The Sigmarites were hunting them, combing the streets like hounds sniffing for prey. But the warband had vanished beneath the skin of the city. A city below a city. Xol'taq led the way, his massive form hunched in the narrow tunnels, his claws flexing, ready to tear apart anything that challenged them. Chaku followed closely, muttering incantations, the faint glow of his staff illuminating the dark with an eerie green light. Juan's shadow disappeared, his chameleon skin shifting to match the filth around them, his presence no more than a whisper. Krokai, forced to stoop beneath the tunnel ceiling, growled in frustration, his massive form barely squeezing through. Zenchai's golden eyes scanned the air, feeling the pull of something ancient. They were close. It was here, a place of the old ones. The enclave revealed. Chaku halted suddenly. He raised his hand, his eyes narrowing as his fingers traced a series of sigils carved into the stone wall beside them, Lizardmen glyphs. Xol'taq stepped forward and pressed his clawed hand against the wall. The air hummed with latent power. Then the stone moved. With a deep, grinding sound, the wall split apart, revealing a hidden passageway leading down into darkness. Warm, humid air rushed up to greet them, carrying the unmistakable scent of jungle flora, a scent impossible in the heart of the Empire. The warband stepped through, and the wall sealed itself behind them. They had entered the last Lizardmen enclave in the old world, the Forgotten Temple. The air was thick with incense, curling in ethereal blue tendrils from sacred braziers. The walls, unlike the sewers above, were pristine, covered in the ancient glyphs of the old ones, untouched by human filth. Towering statues of Xol'taq, Juan, and Itzel loomed over the chamber, their jewel-encrusted eyes glinting in the dim torchlight. The chamber itself was a forgotten temple, a relic from a time when Lustria's warriors had marched in these lands to purge the first taints of chaos. And before them, guarding the last remnants of this ancient stronghold, were Lizardmen. Dozens of skinks emerged from the shadows, blowpipes aimed, their feathered crests bristling in warning. Saurus warriors, heavily scarred and clad in armor of gold and obsidian, gripped their weapons, their eyes locking onto Xol'taq with recognition. At the center of them all stood a skink priest, his age apparent in the deep ridges of his scales, his robes embroidered with glyphs of forgotten power. His eyes narrowed. Xol'taq of Xoltan. Chaku, speaker of prophecies. Why have you come? Chaku stepped forward, bowing his head in reverence. We seek knowledge, Xol'taq. The chaos wastes call to us, and we must know what lies ahead. The old skink's eyes darkened. Then the doom foretold has come. Follow me. The old ones left us something for this day. The relic of sight. Xol'taq led them deep beneath the temple, through halls carved by hands older than humanity itself. They entered a sanctuary, the air alive with pulsing energy. At its center stood a massive obsidian obelisk, its surface covered in spiraling glyphs that glowed faintly in hues of blue and green. The air hummed, as if whispering secrets to those who could understand. The obelisk of Itza, Xol'taq murmured, a gift left by the last great Slan to walk this land. It sees beyond time, beyond space. It will show you what you must face. Zenchai's eyes widened. Then let us see. He stepped forward, placing his scaled hands upon the stone, and the world dissolved into chaos. Visions of the wastes. A maelstrom of fire and shadow, the sky ripped open, bleeding a black storm of screaming souls. They saw the chaos wastes, a land that was alive, its landscapes shifting and pulsing with sickening, unnatural movement. Towering fortresses of brass and bone, rivers of boiling blood, and pits where screaming faces reached toward the sky, trapped in eternal suffering. They saw the Ouroboros of Eternity pulsing like a black sun held aloft by a demon prince, Urzathar, a thing of shifting flesh and cruel laughter, its clawed hands reaching toward the heavens, weaving a spell that would tear reality apart. Then the Warband itself, Tetzuk roaring in defiance, his makwahuidal breaking through demonic flesh. Krakai, his massive fists crushing lesser demons into pulp, his body covered in jagged wounds, but he did not fall. Quenchi's shadow, striking unseen, slicing the throat of a mortal warlock, before vanishing into the madness of the battle. Chaku, his eyes glowing, chanting words of the Old Ones, as the sky split apart with power. Zanchai collapsing, his body twisted by chaos's influence, his eyes wide with horror as dark tendrils coiled around his soul. Then, nothing. Darkness. A whisper in the void. You will fail. You will die. The Oroborus belongs to us. And then, the Warband's fate is sealed. Zanchai gasped, his body shaking violently, the power of the vision still burning in his veins. Xol'taq regarded them silently, his expression unreadable. You have seen what must come. There is no turning back. You must go, now, before the stars shift against you. Tetzuk's claws tightened around his weapon. Chaku bowed his head, the weight of fate pressing heavier than ever. Quenchi's shadow melted into the darkness, unseen, unheard, but knowing his task. The Kai snarled, his massive fists clenched, ready to break whatever stood in their path. Zanchai exhaled, his golden eyes still haunted. They had seen their fate, and still they would not falter, for the Old Ones willed it, and the war for the Ouroboros had truly begun. Chapter 6. Through the Borderlands. The edge of the Drakwald. The Empire. The land here reeked of death. The Drakwald forest was ancient, its roots reaching deep into the bones of the world, a place where the gods' favor had long since rotted away. The trees were twisted, their bark scarred by war and sorcery, their branches bent like grasping claws. The air was thick with rot and decay, a mixture of damp earth, stagnant water, and the iron stink of old blood. Even the wildlife was wrong. Ravens with too many eyes watched from the canopy. In the underbrush, things scuttled that should not exist, their half-formed limbs twitching and dragging them unnaturally through the muck. The Warband moved cautiously, their reptilian eyes keen in the dark, their movements soundless as they passed between the ancient trees. They had left the human roads behind, choosing the wild paths to avoid further entanglements with Sigmarite zealots and Imperial patrols. But there were worse things than men in these woods. Much worse. The mutant's trail. Tetzuk was the first to smell it, a stench so foul it clawed at the throat, a combination of rotting meat, burned hair, and foul sorcery. Chaku raised a clawed hand, signaling the Warband to halt. His frilled crest flared, his nostrils twitching. They are close, too close. Quenchi's shadow was already gone, melting into the darkness, his camouflaged scales shifting seamlessly with the bark of the trees. Krokai, gripping his massive war maul, snorted in annoyance. Let 'em come. We crush. We kill. We move on. But this was not a mere warband of beasts. This was something else. Zanchai's golden eyes glowed faintly, his fingers tracing the air, feeling the residual magic woven into the very fabric of the forest. Zane's spawn walked this path. They have tasted sorcery. They are not like the mindless brutes of Khorne. They think. They scheme. Tetzok's grip tightened on his weapon. Then we kill them before they think too much. And so they pressed forward, moving through the web of corrupted roots and twisted branches, toward the smell of blasphemy and blood. The ambush. They found the first corpse slumped against the base of an ancient oak, or at least what was left of it. The body had no skin, stripped to the raw muscle and bone, yet it was not rotting. Instead, it pulsed, veins still full of something thick and black, its ribcage cracked open, its organs rearranged into blasphemous symbols. Chaku snarled. A sacrifice, a spell of sight. They know we are here. And then the forest erupted. The first arrow came from the shadows, whistling through the air. Tetzok twisted at the last moment, the corrupted projectile barely missing his skull and embedding into a tree, sprouting writhing tendrils where it struck. Then came the screams. Not human, not beast, but something in between. From the gloom they came. A pack of tzeentch-marked beastmen, their horns twisted into unnatural spirals, their eyes glowing with sickly, multicolored light. Their fur was patchy, burned away in places, revealing flesh covered in shifting runes that crawled like living tattoos. Some had extra limbs, jagged beaks, or half-formed wings that twitched uncontrollably. They moved fast. Too fast. One lunged at Krokai, a four-armed horror, its clawed hands crackling with arcane fire. It shrieked in a language older than man, raising its hands, and a bolt of blue lightning surged toward the Kroxigger's face. The Krokai did not stop. With a roaring charge, he smashed his maul into the beast's torso, caving in its ribs, sending a spray of black ichor and shredded lungs across the ground. The body convulsed violently, its mutated organs twisting and reshaping, trying to form something new, but Krokai was faster. He stomped down on the thing's skull, crushing it to pulp beneath his immense weight. Another beastman swung its rusted cleaver toward Tetzok, but the old blood was already moving. He ducked low, letting the blade pass harmlessly overhead, then ripped upward with his claws, tearing the creature's stomach open from groin to throat. Its intestines spilled out in steaming coils, and as the thing screamed, he ended its suffering with a bone-shattering strike to the head, splitting its skull in half. Huan Chi's shadow was invisible, death unseen. A beastman lurched forward, a staff of bone and feathers raised high, its mouth spilling incomprehensible chants. An unseen force gathered, the air around it warping as it prepared a spell of destruction. Then a poisoned dagger slid across its throat. It had not even noticed Huan Chi's shadow behind it. Its chanting turned to gurgling, its eyes widened, and it collapsed, clutching at its ruptured throat, bleeding out in silence. Chaku was not idle. His staff crackled, a green burst of ancient power surging forward, slamming into a shrieking beastman. The creature howled as its flesh turned to liquid, its body collapsing in on itself, its bones snapping like dried twigs as it melted into a steaming pile of filth. More came. Dozens. The Warband fought like cornered beasts, their blades tearing through corrupted flesh, their claws rending mutants limb from limb. The ground became slick with blackened blood, the air choked with the dying screams of the unworthy. But the beastmen did not stop. They would never stop. Not until the Warband was dead, or they were. And then the trees screamed. A sound so unnatural, so alien, it rattled the soul itself. Zanchai's eyes snapped wide, his voice breaking into a cry of warning. They call something greater. We must end this now. Tetzok turned, his eyes locking onto the shaman, the true source of the chaos, a towering creature of patchwork flesh, its body a living altar of mutation, its head a pulsating orb of sickening light. Without a word, he charged. The shaman turned, raising its staff, chanting faster, its voice merging with 100 others that did not belong in this world. Too late. Tetzok's Makuwaitl struck home, its obsidian teeth slicing through the shaman's grotesque head, cleaving it in half from crown to chest. The magic died instantly. The beastmen froze, their souls severed from their unnatural gifts. Then they screamed, not as warriors, but as prey, and the Warband butchered them all. The Drekwold fell silent once more. They had survived, for now, and the chaos wastes awaited. Chapter 7. Crossing the Northern Wastes. The edge of the world, Norska. The air was colder now, the bitter sting of the northern wastes biting through even the thick scales of the Warband. The land had changed. Gone were the twisted, suffocating forests of the Drekwold. Gone were the tangled roots and whispering shadows that concealed horrors beneath the earth. Now, there was only barren tundra, jagged mountains, and the icy winds that carried the stench of blood and fire. They had reached Norska, the land of the war-mad, the blood-drunk, and the damned. And here they were not welcome. The raiders. They moved under the cover of twilight, keeping low as they crossed the frozen wastelands, avoiding the great warbands that prowled the hills like hunting packs. The Norse were always at war, if not with the soft lands of the south, then with each other. There were few true kings here, only chieftains who ruled for a time before their skulls joined the piles of the next warlord's trophies. But some tribes had fallen further than others. Tetzok crouched low, his piercing reptilian gaze scanning the valley below. His breath came in short, slow huffs, his muscles coiled, ready to spring into battle if needed. What he saw was a slaughter. A ruined Norse village, its huts burned to the ground, the earth soaked black with frozen blood. The bodies lay strewn like discarded dolls, their limbs torn away, their guts spilling into the ice. Krokai let out a low, rumbling growl, his fists clenching around his weapon. This is not war, this is butchery. Chaku moved forward, sniffing the air, his slitted eyes narrowed. Chaos did this, not just men, something else. Then they heard it, a deep, guttural chanting, voices carried by the howling wind. And beyond the ruins, atop a ridge of jagged rock, they saw them. A warband of chaos worshippers, clad in furs, rusted iron and the blood of the fallen. Their skin was scarred, painted in dark symbols, and their eyes burned with unnatural hunger. Some carried brutal axes and cleavers, others had blades fused to their very flesh, their bodies twisted by the gifts of the dark gods. And at the center of them all, their leader, a towering Norse champion, his flesh pockmarked with writhing mutations, his jaw split unnaturally wide, revealing a jagged maw of fangs and blackened gums. His armor was a ruin of rusted plate and bone, and in his right hand he held a massive greatsword, its blade etched with dark runes that pulsed with sickly light. He was not a man any more. He was a chosen of chaos, and they were feeding on the dead. The warband watched as the Norsemen ripped into the corpses, tearing raw flesh from the bones, gnawing with animalistic fervor. The sound of bones snapping beneath their teeth was sickening, the wet slurps and guttural laughter like the chorus of a nightmare. Zenchi's fingers twitched toward his staff, his lips pulling back in a silent snarl. We cannot fight them, not here, not now. Tetzok's jaw clenched. Every instinct screamed for blood, for vengeance. But they would not win. Not against this many, not in open ground. Huan Che's shadow spoke from the darkness. His voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of finality. We move, now. The warband vanished into the night, slipping away like ghosts, leaving the warped Norsemen to their bloody feast. The wary tribe. They traveled for 2 more days, keeping to the mountains, avoiding Norse raiding parties, until they came across something unusual. A living village. The warband watched from the ridge as fires burned in great pits, their orange glow flickering against the walls of crude wooden fortifications. Norse warriors patrolled the perimeter, but these were not the same as those they had seen before. Their armor was intact, their weapons sharp, their bodies uncorrupted. They were warriors, but they had not yet fallen to chaos. Zanchai murmured, more to himself than the others. They are not lost, not yet. Chaku nodded. Then we speak to them. We need passage, we need food. They need allies, even if they do not know it yet. Xol'taq frowned but said nothing. He hated dealing with humans, but the path forward was clear. With weapons hidden, the Warband descended. The bartering of blades. They were met at spear point. The Norse did not trust them. They were creatures, monsters, not of the blood of the North. But their chieftain, an older warrior named Ulfric Stonai, listened. He sat upon a wooden throne, a massive axe resting across his knees, his gray-streaked hair unkempt, his single remaining eye sharp and intelligent. Xol'taq spoke as little as possible, letting Chata handle the words. The skink priest explained the threat, the warbands of chaos, the beast things that fed on their people. He spoke of gods older than their own, of the Old One's war against the dark powers, and how chaos would not stop with the Lizardmen. It would consume all. Ulfric listened, and then he laughed. You speak well, little beast, but the North does not barter with words. It barters with steel. If you want safe passage, you fight for it. Xol'taq's blood stirred. Then bring me a blade. The pit was cleared, the tribe gathered, and the duel began. His opponent was a Norse champion, a mountain of a man, his arms thick as tree trunks, his greatsword heavy as a boulder. He charged, roaring. Xol'taq met him head-on. The first strike nearly split his chest open, but he sidestepped, spinning low, his macuital slicing through flesh. The Norse warrior staggered but did not fall. He came again, swinging wildly. Xol'taq caught the blade on his own, sparks screaming between them, before he drove his claws into the man's stomach, ripping through armor and skin alike. The warrior's eyes bulged, his mouth filling with blood. Xol'taq wrenched his claws free, and the Norseman fell to his knees, clutching at his spilling entrails, gasping for air that would never come. A final strike to the skull ended him. The tribe fell silent. Then Ulfric grinned. You have your passage, beast, but do not stay long. The North is not kind to your kind. The warband moved on. Norska was behind them. The chaos wastes lay ahead, and their true battle was about to begin. Chapter 8. The Sorcerer's Gambit. The bleeding tundra, chaos wastes. The air itself was wrong. The warband had passed beyond the last of the Norse settlements, beyond the frozen rivers and jagged peaks, into the blasted nightmare that was the chaos wastes. Here, the very earth twisted beneath their feet, its surface a shifting landscape of unnatural hues, its cracks bleeding, sluggish streams of molten corruption. The sky churned in impossible colors, streaks of violet lightning slashing through thick black clouds, while distant mountain ranges shifted shape when not directly observed. Time and space bent, the horizon stretching and contracting as if the world itself was breathing. And yes, the warband pressed on. Xol'taq led the way, his great obsidian makuahutil clenched tight, his clawed feet sinking into the crimson-stained snow. Chaku walked beside him, his golden eyes sharp, scanning for signs of sorcery. Huanchi's shadow was already gone, slipping into the gloom, watching unseen. Krokai muttered dark curses, his massive form hunched against the unholy wind that whispered in languages that no mortal should hear. Zanchai moved carefully, his celestial sight warning him of things hidden beyond the veil of reality. They all felt it. They were being watched. The ambush. The attack came without warning. A surge of unnatural force rippled through the air, reality cracking open as a burst of blue flame erupted in their path. A figure stepped forward, clad in midnight robes, his form half hidden beneath a tattered cloak of shifting runes. His face was pale and gaunt, veins bulging with unnatural energy, his eyes glowing with the eerie light of the Changer of Ways. The Chaos Sorcerer of Tzeentch. The Warband reacted instantly. Tetzuk lunged, swinging his makwahutl in a blur of obsidian death, aiming to cleave the sorcerer in half before the first spell could be cast. But the blade hit nothing but air. The sorcerer was gone, his form dissolving into a cloud of blue mist, reforming several feet away with an amused chuckle. Ah, magnificent! So eager to kill, so bound by simple cause and effect. But you cannot slay what is not truly here. Zanchai snarled, his hands glowing with celestial power, preparing to unleash a bolt of divine wrath, but before he could act, the sorcerer raised a single withered hand, and time froze. The Warband felt their bodies lock, their minds slowing, as if reality itself had been slowed to the pace of dripping wax. Only their eyes moved, their thoughts trapped within a prison of eldritch sorcery. The sorcerer smiled. Ah, the children of the Old Ones. So resilient, so devoted, yet so very limited. He walked between them, running bony fingers over their scales, studying them as if they were mere specimens in a grand experiment. Then he stopped before Chaku, tilting his head. You see it, don't you, little priest? The Ouroboros turns once more. Its slumber is ending, and Xoltan. His grin widened, revealing blackened, rotting teeth. He is already coming. A pulse of energy surged through the air. The spell shattered. Time snapped back to normal, and the Warband exploded into action. Tetzuk's claws lashed forward, aiming to tear out the sorcerer's throat. But again the wretch vanished, reappearing several feet away, standing atop a jagged black rock, laughing softly. Yar, kill me now and you lose the only soul willing to guide you through this wretched place. The sorcerer's bargain. Tetzuk growled, his muscles coiling, his body ready to lunge again. But Chaku raised a hand, his expression dark. He speaks of Xoltan. He knows more than he should. The sorcerer bowed mockingly, his tattered robes billowing. Of course I do. Xoltan has sought the Oroboros for centuries. You think your feeble gods are the only ones who seek its power? The Changer of Ways has guided my steps for decades. I have seen the ruins. I have walked the paths beyond mortal sight. Zanchai hissed. You reek of lies and deceit. Your words are poison. The sorcerer smirked. And yet poison is often the only cure for greater ills. Let us not pretend you have any other options. You are lost here. You know nothing of the shifting paths. The wastes do not obey your rules. Time bends. Space is not as it seems. You could walk for years and never reach your prize. But I... His grin sharpened. I know where the Ouroboros of Eternity sleeps. And I am willing to share that knowledge for a price. Tetzuk snarled. Eh? Why would you betray your kind? The sorcerer's grin faltered, his eyes darkening. Because Xoltan's ascension will not just reshape this world. It will erase me. I have seen it in my dreams. He will devour even his own servants. There will be no change, no knowledge, no madness, no enlightenment, only unending ruin. Rokai snorted, his grip tightening on his maul. I say we break his bones and take his knowledge, no need for his words. But Chaku spoke, his voice measured. We take his deal, then we kill him later. The sorcerer laughed, knowing full well what was meant. Oh, how I do enjoy your kind, so delightfully straightforward. The revelation. The sorcerer's eyes gleamed. He lifted his bony fingers, tracing a pattern in the air, and the sky ripped open. The Warbands saw visions, a city of obsidian, lost beneath the sands of time itself. Towering black spires, their surfaces crawling with runes older than the world. And at its heart, the Ouroboros of Eternity, spinning slowly, its surface etched with the glyphs of the Old Ones, a power older than chaos itself, pulsing at its core. The city was called Xol'taq, a place that should not exist, a place hidden beyond time, beyond fate. There, that is where your god's precious relic slumbers, and there is where Yurzathar marches even now. You are not the only ones seeking the prize. You are merely the last to arrive. The vision faded. Xol'taq growled low, his blood boiling. They were already behind. There was no time left to waste. The sorcerer smiled one last time. Now, if you'll excuse me, I will take my leave. He turned to vanish once more. But Quan Chi's shadow was faster. A single poison dagger slid into the sorcerer's spine, twisting deep, severing something vital. The sorcerer's eyes bulged. "Oh, you clever." He collapsed, his body convulsing, his own dark magic sputtering out. Chaku stepped forward, his expression unreadable. The Old Ones do not tolerate heresy. The Warband left his corpse bleeding into the snow, and then they marched toward their destiny. Chapter 9. The Frozen Hellscape. The Threshold of Madness. The Chaos Wastes. The air itself was poison. The Warbands stepped beyond the last remnants of mortal lands, crossing into the heart of damnation itself. The chaos wastes stretched before them, an unholy, shifting nightmare, a realm where the laws of reality had been gutted and left to rot. The ground was no longer solid, but something half-formed, a mixture of glass, ash, and writhing flesh. The ice beneath their feet twitched like muscle, veins bulging just below the surface, as if the very earth was alive and dreaming of agony. The wind screamed, though there was nothing there to make a sound. The sky was a sickening vortex of colors that should not exist, twisting in on itself, breathing, rippling like a wound torn into the fabric of the world. And far, far ahead, barely visible through the maelstrom of insanity, stood their goal, the city of Xol'taq, where the Ouroboros of Eternity slumbered. But the wastes would not let them pass unchallenged. The warping of reality. The deeper they walked, the more broken the world became. Xol'taq felt his own heartbeat slow, as if time itself was stuttering, skipping like a broken drumbeat. He turned to speak to Chaku, only to see the skink priest frozen mid-step, his body locked in a moment that had already passed. A second later, Chaku was ahead of them, glancing back as if nothing had happened. Crow growled, his massive hands clenching his maul, but the sound came before his mouth moved, his voice repeating over itself, overlapping in an endless echo. Quan Chi's shadow blinked out of existence for a heartbeat, only to appear 20 paces away, his eyes wide, his body tense, as if he had just escaped something only he could see. Xoltan muttered a prayer to the Old Ones, his golden eyes scanning the impossible landscape, but even his voice wavered, his words twisting mid-sentence, as if the very concept of language was decaying around them. We must not stay here long. Here must not stay long, we must. Then the ground split open beneath them, the lake of screaming ice. They tumbled forward as the earth collapsed, throwing them onto a vast frozen lake. But this was no mere ice sheet. Beneath the surface, faces twisted in agony. 1,000 souls, their hands pressed against the ice from below, their mouths open in soundless, eternal screams, their eyes locked onto the warband, their desperate fingers clawing. But the ice did not break, trapping them in unending torment. Crokai stepped forward, his massive foot cracking the ice beneath him. A face twisted to look up at him, its lips peeling back, revealing a black void where its throat should be. Then it spoke. "Your gods have abandoned you, lizard thing." Croquet staggered back, his teeth bared in fury. Another voice rose from below, a skink's face half melted into the ice, its eyes rolling wildly in their sockets. "The old ones are dead, forgotten, dust and nothing. The gods of chaos are forever." Chaku hissed, raising his staff, but the ice rippled beneath them, and the trapped souls began to shift, their mouths stretching wider and wider until their faces split apart, birthing something new. Something hungry. The ice spawn? The souls melted into the ice, and from their places, things began to rise. They were not men, not beasts, not daemons, but something in between, bodies formed of twisted ice and liquefied flesh, their jagged limbs bent at unnatural angles, their mouths frozen open in permanent screams. One lunged forward, its fingers elongated into razor-sharp talons, aiming for Xanchay's throat. He reacted instantly, his hands flaring with celestial light, and with a single blinding gesture he tore the thing apart, its body exploding into shards of corrupted ice. But there were dozens more. Tetzok roared, his Makuahuitl swinging in a blur, shattering bodies, splitting torsos, sending frozen limbs spinning through the air. He did not care if they felt pain. He did not care if they could die. He would break them until nothing remained. Rokai swung his war maul, crushing two creatures in one devastating strike, their forms splintering like glass, their shrieks vanishing into the void. Chaku unleashed a wave of emerald fire, scorching through the ice, melting the spawn back into the abyss that birthed them. Huan Chi's shadow moved like a ghost, his daggers flashing, severing limbs before his enemies even knew he was there. And still, the things kept coming. The Warband fought, the ice cracking beneath their feet, the wind screaming in their ears, the sky pulsing with madness. And then, something shifted. The ice split apart, and from the depths of the frozen abyss, a monstrous, writhing shape emerged. A colossal entity of shifting frost, its form constantly breaking and reforming, its glowing eyes endless pits of frozen torment. It was not a demon. It was not a beast. It was the wastes themselves, given form. And it hungered for them. The escape. Xanchai screamed a warning, his staff flaring with blinding light. "We must leave, now." Chaku slammed his staff against the ice, summoning a pulse of power that shattered the lake beneath them, creating a path of collapsing ice flows. Tetzok grabbed Huan Chi's shadow, hurling him forward, sending the chameleon skink skidding across the breaking ice toward the solid ground ahead. Croquet roared, grabbing Xanchai and Chaku in his massive arms, barreling forward through the collapsing nightmare, his massive footfalls shaking the earth beneath them. The entity shrieked, its form splitting apart, reforming, reaching for them with limbs that cracked and shattered with every movement. But it was too slow. The Warband burst from the ice, throwing themselves onto the solid, shifting tundra, just as the lake collapsed behind them, the horror vanishing into the abyss with an unearthly, echoing wail. The Warband lay panting, their breath steaming in the unnatural cold, their weapons dripping with shards of corrupted frost. They had survived. But the chaos wastes had only begun their torment. Ahead, far in the distance, the black spires of Xol'taq loomed, waiting for them like a tombstone. The Ouroboros was near, but so was madness. And something far, far worse. Chapter 10. Lost in the Realm of Chaos. The storm of madness, chaos, waste. The sky split apart. Reality twisted. One moment, the Warband marched forward, their bodies battered but unbroken, the spires of Xol'taq looming in the distance. The next, the warp storm struck. The air screamed, howling with 1,000 broken voices, each whispering secrets no mind should hear. The ground heaved, its surface splitting open, revealing a roiling abyss of color and shadow, tendrils of raw chaos lashing upward, hungrily grasping for the Warband. Then, the storm swallowed them whole. Xoltaq's trial, the army of the dead. Xoltaq awoke to silence. He stood upon the shattered ruins of Xoltan, his home, his temple, city. But it was wrong. The sky wept black rain, and the pyramids that once pierced the heavens now lay in ruin, their sacred glyphs defaced, their holy corridors awash with blood. And they were waiting for him. Rows upon rows of Saurus warriors, their bodies half decayed, their armor rusted and broken, their eyes hollow and empty. Some bore weapons shattered from ancient wars, others had jagged bones protruding through their flesh, their bodies barely holding together. Yet they did not fall. At their center stood a figure Xoltaq knew well, his own reflection. But it was not him. The mirror Xoltaq was corrupted. His scales blackened, his makua hootle dripping with the blood of his own kin, his eyes glowing with a malevolent, unholy light. It spoke, its voice a deep, unnatural echo of his own. You were too weak to save them. The old ones abandoned you. And so I have done what you could not. I have embraced the power that remains. The undead army charged. Xoltaq roared in defiance, his own makua weetle flashing, and he met them head-on. His blades split skulls, severed rotting limbs, carved through bone and armor alike, but no matter how many he killed, more took their place. They were his brothers, his warriors, his kin, but there was no saving them, only slaughter. And as he fought, his reflection laughed, watching as Xoltaq became a beast, lost in carnage, his own form becoming darker, the blackness of the storm seeping into his flesh. He was becoming it, and he had to break free before it was too late. Chaku's trial, the wrath of the old ones. Chaku knelt before the great Slan, his head bowed. The temple was golden, pristine, untouched by time. The air was rich with the power of the old ones, flowing through the sacred stone, humming through the very bones of the world. And yet something was wrong. He looked up, and his breath caught in his throat. The Slan was dead. Its massive, bloated body was withered, its flesh cracked and dry, its mouth twisted into a grotesque rictus of silent agony. Around him, the other Slan sat lifeless, their once golden eyes hollow, their powers extinguished, their divine guidance no more than dust. And then they spoke, with voices filled with disappointment, their words pressing into his skull like daggers. You have failed us. The walls collapsed, and suddenly he was standing in Lustria, but it was not Lustria. It was burning. The jungle was ablaze, its trees turned to blackened husks, its rivers boiling with corruption. And in the distance, he saw Xol'taq, his beloved master, his guide, his god among gods. But Xol'taq was dying, his body withering, his powers draining into the chaos-infested sky. You were not worthy. You could not protect me. You have let the old ones fall. Chaku screamed, clutching his head as the world twisted around him, his own faith unraveling. But then, something deep inside him snapped. His hand tightened around his staff. No, I will not be deceived. The old ones do not fall. His will surged, and the vision shattered, leaving him alone in the storm once more. Hun Chi's shadow's trial, the eyes of the gods. Huan Chi's shadow was nowhere. He was everywhere. The shadows surrounded him, shifting, twisting, taking form, not of men, not of beasts, but of watchers, unseen, unknowable entities whose glowing eyes never blinked. He had spent his life hiding, hunting, moving, unseen. Now he was exposed. You think you are the predator? You have always been prey. He tried to move, but he couldn't. His body did not exist. He had become nothing, and the Watchers moved closer. He had to become something again. With every ounce of his will, he forced himself to exist. And the world snapped back. He dropped into reality once more, panting, shaking, his blades warm in his hands, his eyes clear once more. Across Trial, the weight of flesh. Xol'taq stood alone, but he was not himself. He was small, a hatchling no larger than the skinks he had once dwarfed, his massive strength stripped away, his hands no more than feeble claws. And surrounding him were giants, Kroxigors like him, but twisted, deformed, their scales blackened, their bodies covered in bony protrusions and warped muscles. He laughed at him, weakening. You were never strong enough. Your might was a lie. Without it, you are nothing. They crushed him beneath their feet, snapping his bones, his roars turning into pathetic squeals. And then he remembered who he was. He was Xol'taq, the crusher of men, the breaker of demons, the unrelenting fist of the old ones. He forced his body back to size, his strength rushing into his limbs, and he tore the vision apart with a roar that shattered the illusion. Reuniting in the storm. One by one, the Warband emerged from the nightmare, breaking free of their own torments, their minds scarred but intact. The storm still raged around them, but they had beaten it. Together they stood once more. Xol'taq lay ahead. The Ouroboros called, and they would not break again. Chapter 11. Fortress of the Blood God. The Bastion of Skulls, Chaos Wastes. The Warband marched onward, their bodies weary from the horrors of the warp storm, but their purpose unshaken. Before them, in the distance, loomed a fortress unlike any other, a monument to brutality, a temple of slaughter that rose from the bleeding earth itself. The walls were built from skulls, stacked high, fused together by rivers of molten brass. Atop the towers, spiked banners fluttered in the cursed wind, each stitched with the flayed flesh of warriors who had fallen to its inhabitants. The air reeked of iron and blood, the very sky above twisted into an unholy crimson, as if the heavens themselves bled in reverence to what lay below. This was Khazrak, the fortress of the Blood God, a bastion of Khorne's chosen, where only the strong were allowed to live, and where the weak were cast into the pits to be devoured. And it stood directly in their path, the challenge of Khorne. As the Warband approached, the gates groaned open, and from within, warriors poured forth, not as a charging army, but as hunters who had smelled prey. They were clad in heavy plate, their armor scarred and stained with centuries of gore, their weapons massive and cruel, axes, flails, cleavers, weapons designed to pulverize flesh and shatter bone. At their head stood the largest of them all, a chaos champion, his form monstrous, his armor fused to his flesh, his jaw distended into a permanent snarl, his eyes burned with the fire of his dark god, and from his back jutted a twisted, bony protrusion, a half-formed wing that twitched violently. "Lizard things," the champion bellowed, his voice like grinding iron, his breath thick with the stench of raw meat and dried blood. "You tread upon the domain of Khorne. You will die here. Your skulls will adorn the throne of the Blood God." Xol'taq stepped forward, his massive form unwavering, his golden eyes burning with primal fury. "We seek only passage. We do not fear you, but we will not waste blood where it is not needed." The Chaos Warriors laughed, their voices harsh, cruel. "There is no passage, lizard thing. Only slaughter. The weak die, the strong live." But the champion raised a hand. He studied Xol'taq, and something in his warped mind recognized a fellow warrior, another beast forged by battle, another killer worthy of Khorne's attention. There is one way, Reptile. The arena. The warriors roared in approval, slamming their weapons against their shields, a sound like 100 war drums beating in unison. Face me, lizard. Face me in the pits of Gar-Khazrak. Prove your strength, or be torn apart. Win, and you may pass. Lose, and your skull is mine. Tetzok did not hesitate. I accept. The warband said nothing. There was nothing to say. Tetzok's fate was sealed. The gates of the fortress opened wider, and the warband was led inside, surrounded by laughing warriors, eager to see blood spilled upon the sands. The arena of slaughter. The arena was a pit of agony, carved into the bones of the earth itself. Thousands of Khornate warriors sat in the tiered stands, their jeering voices mixing with the howls of the damned, their frenzied energy shaking the very ground beneath them. The arena floor was drenched in blood, the bones of past challengers still scattered across its surface. And at the far end, behind a great gate of black iron, Tetzok's opponent awaited him. The champion of Khorne. The gates thundered open, and a monster emerged. The Chaos Champion was no longer entirely mortal. His flesh had warped, his muscles swollen with unnatural power. His armor fused into his body, making him a walking mountain of spiked steel and corded muscle. His weapon was a colossal axe, its blade wreathed in an eerie, flickering red glow, the power of 1,000 slaughtered souls trapped within its cursed metal. He lifted it high, and the arena erupted in madness, warriors howling, screaming, chanting for blood. Tetzok stepped forward, Makwawahut gripped tightly, his golden eyes locked onto his opponent. The fight began. The duel to the death. The Chaos Champion charged, moving with inhuman speed, his axe cleaving downward, aiming to split Tetzok in half from skull to tail. Tetzok dodged at the last second, the blade slamming into the earth, splitting the stone apart, sending shards of rock flying in all directions. The old blood countered instantly, stepping inside the champion's guard, his obsidian blade flashing, striking a deep wound across the warrior's side, black blood spraying onto the sand. The champion roared, spinning, his gauntleted fist slamming into Tetzok's chest, sending him hurtling across the arena, slamming into the stone wall with bone-shattering force. But Tetzok did not fall. He rose, spitting blood, and charged again. The two warriors clashed, their weapons screaming against each other, obsidian versus cursed steel, flesh tearing, armor denting, bone breaking. The Chaos Champion was stronger, but Tetzok was faster, and Tetzok had been born for war. A feint, a sudden sidestep, a swing at the exposed throat. The Macuitl struck true, shattering the champion's lower jaw, sending teeth and blood flying. The warrior stumbled, his axe dipping for just a moment. And in that moment, Tetzok struck one final time. The Macuitl cleaved into the champion's skull, its obsidian blade sinking deep, tearing through flesh, bone, and brain alike. The Chaos Warrior shuddered, his hands twitching, then collapsed onto the sand, his body still convulsing, his soul ripped from existence by the fury of Khorne himself. The arena fell silent. Then, a deafening roar of approval. The Khornate warriors howled, pounding their chests, raising their weapons, exulting Tetzok's victory in the name of the blood god. Tetzok stood over his fallen enemy, his breath ragged, his body drenched in his own blood and that of his foe. And then, the fortress gates opened once more. They had won their passage. The warband moved forward, leaving the howling warriors behind, marching toward the black spires of Xol'taq. The Ouroboros awaited, and blood had been spilled to reach it. Chapter 12. The Garden of Plague. The Rotting Expanse. Nurgle's Domain. The warband moved forward, but the world itself fought against them. The air was thick with disease, an unholy miasma of rot and bile hanging over the landscape like a death shroud. The ground was soft, bloated, swollen with pus-filled blisters that burst underfoot, releasing clouds of writhing flies and the stench of putrefaction. This was no natural swamp. This was a corpse given form, a festering wound in reality, a place where life and death had lost meaning, where flesh decayed before the soul had even departed. This was the garden of Nurgle, and it wanted them, the plague forms. The first sign of danger was the movement in the water. At first it was small ripples, little more than the disturbance of insects on the stagnant, moss-covered pools. But then the ripples became waves, and from the filthy depths they began to rise. The plague forms, once men, once beasts, once living things. Now they were nothing but swollen sacks of filth, their bodies engorged with pus and corruption, their faces sagging, eyes dripping from bloated sockets, their gaping maws lined with jagged yellowed teeth. Some still bore remnants of armor, rusted beyond recognition, their flesh fused to the corroded metal, their weapons dripping with the festering ichor of 1,000 rotting wounds. They moved slowly but with relentless purpose, their gurgling laughter bubbling through maggot-filled throats as they dragged themselves toward the warband, their slime-covered fingers reaching hungrily. The warband reacted instantly. Xol'taq roared, his macuatl flashing, cleaving through rotting torsos, splitting bloated skulls, but the plague forms did not stop. They did not die. Every wound he inflicted, every limb severed, merely oozed and reformed, the rot knitting itself back together, their laughter never ceasing. Quan Chi's shadow moved like a ghost, his daggers flashing, severing spines, piercing bloated guts, but the plague forms merely giggled, their open wounds spilling wriggling parasites instead of blood. Xanchai raised his hands, summoning the power of the stars, a blast of celestial fire erupting from his fingertips, incinerating the nearest monstrosities in a wave of burning holy energy. But it was not enough. There were too many. And then came the moment of horror. Crokai Falls. The largest of the plague forms surged forward, an enormous bloated horror, its body a writhing mass of swollen pustules, its arms fused together into a massive club of rotting meat and exposed bone. It swung. The impact was monstrous, a sickening crunch that sent Crokai flying, his massive form crashing into the filth-ridden swamp, submerging him beneath the blackened waters. For a moment, all was silent. Then, bubbles rose to the surface. Crokai emerged, but something was wrong. His scales were peeling, his veins bulging, his muscles spasming uncontrollably. His eyes rolled back, his throat bulged unnaturally as his own body betrayed him. "The sickness! It's inside me!" he roared, his voice thick and gurgling, his massive fists clawing at his own flesh as pus leaked from his wounds, his muscles twisting with unnatural bulges. Nurgle had taken root within him. If they did not find a cure, he would become one of them. Chaku sprinted forward, his hands glowing with divine energy, trying to slow the infection, but it was spreading fast. There is only one way. The old ones left something in these lands, a temple, a cure. We must reach it. Xol'taq nodded. Then we move now. The temple of the lost Slan. Guided by Chaku's visions, they pushed deeper into the swamp, carving a path through endless waves of the plague forms, their blades flashing, their bodies drenched in rot and ichor, the air filled with the sound of rending flesh and laughter that would never end. Then they saw it, a temple half sunken into the swamp, its stonework ancient, its glyphs long worn away by time and decay. Vines choked its sacred form, and thick clouds of disease-carrying insects swarmed its entrance, their buzzing forming blasphemous words in the air. But this was their only hope. They rushed forward, Crokai barely able to stand, his body swelling grotesquely, his breathing ragged and wet. And then the plague priest emerged. the guardian of decay. From the temple's entrance waddled a monstrosity, a skink, once a priest of the Old Ones, now nothing but a bloated, diseased servant of Nurgle. His robes hung in tatters, his flesh melted and fused into the very stone he stood upon, his once sharp eyes now milky and full of rot. His voice was a wet, gurgling croak, filled with mockery and delight. "Ah, little spawn of the Old Ones, you seek to undo what grandfather has gifted? You seek to cleanse this beloved filth? How ungrateful!" The ground ruptured, and from beneath the filth, tendrils of blackened flesh surged forward, grasping for the warband, their slimy lengths wrapping around ankles, wrists, necks, pulling them toward the waiting embrace of disease. Xol'taq fought back, hacking through the tendrils, but the priest of Nurgle only laughed, his hands raised, summoning forth a storm of writhing, pestilent maggots, their bodies burrowing into flesh, gnawing at scales and muscle alike. Uruk-hai fell to his knees, his skin blackening, his breath turning into thick, bubbling foam. They were losing. Chaku screamed a prayer, his voice carrying the weight of desperation, and suddenly the temple's inner sanctum flared to life. A burst of emerald light erupted from within, its power ancient, divine, untouched by time. The glyphs ignited, their lost words returning, and the filth that had choked the stone for centuries burned away. The plague priest howled, his twisted form writhing, his putrid flesh sloughing off in great chunks. "No, this place was ours. Nurgle blessed it. Nurgle." His words turned to shrieks as the light engulfed him, his form breaking apart, his body unraveling into filth and slime, until nothing remained but the echo of his agony. The plague forms outside convulsed, their bodies melting, their souls screaming as they were torn from existence. The Warbands stood, bloodied, broken, victorious. And at the temple's center, bathed in the light of the Old Ones, they found it. A sacred font, its waters untouched by corruption. Chaku wasted no time. Uruk-hai was lowered into the blessed waters, and with a scream that shook the heavens, the plague was torn from his flesh, leaving him whole once more. The warband had survived, but the chaos wastes had only just begun their torments. Ahead, Excupolis awaited, and with it the Ouroboros of Eternity. Chapter 13. The Silver Tower's Trickery. The Mirage City, realm of Xint. The land had changed again. The Warband had barely left the rotting remains of the Nurgle-tainted swamp, the stench of plague still clinging to their scales, when the world twisted around them. What had once been endless wasteland, ash, ice, and stone, was suddenly something else entirely. Before them lay a city of impossible beauty. Great spires of shifting silver rose into the sky, their surfaces shimmering like molten mercury, reflecting images of things that did not exist. The streets, paved in ornate lapis and gold, wound in impossible patterns, twisting and looping back upon themselves, leading into doorways that led nowhere and everywhere at once. It was mesmerizing, a vision of impossible splendor in a land of chaos and ruin. But Chaku knew it was a lie. His frilled crest stiffened, his golden eyes narrowing as he felt the humming energy of sorcery thick in the air. This was not a city, this was a trap, and it had already claimed them. The arrival of the trickster. The warband slowed as they approached, their instincts at war with what their eyes beheld. Xol'taq, ever the warrior, kept his makuahuidl gripped tight, but his usual caution was wavering, his gaze drawn toward the shining towers, his steps leading him deeper into the maze of streets. Uruk-hai grunted, confused. His massive claws flexed, but even his beast-like mind was muddied, his instincts screaming danger even as the city welcomed them. Huan Chi's shadow was already gone, vanishing into the alleys, his form blurring as the very walls of the city shifted around him, twisting to swallow him whole. Zanchai's eyes gleamed, his celestial senses tingling, but even he was not untouched by the illusions. It was then that it appeared. A figure emerged from the shifting streets, a thing of long, flowing robes, its face hidden behind an ornate golden mask, its body flickering between solid form and ghostly mirage. A Zentian demon. Oz. Travelers from the waking world. How rare, how precious, how delightful. Come, come, walk freely, walk deeply, stay forever. Its voice slithered through the air, smooth as silk, yet filled with 1,000 hidden meanings, every syllable bending reality itself. Xol'taq staggered, his eyes losing focus for the first time in his long, war-forged life. His mind was clouding, the warrior's instincts fading beneath the pull of something far older, far deeper than mere sorcery. Rest your weapons, mighty ones. Lay down your burdens. You have won. Do you not see? You have reached Kulathis. The Ouroboros is here. The warband froze. Chakta's breath caught. No, no! This is a lie. This is not ex-Kulathis. The others did not hear him. Or rather, they chose not to hear him. The illusion had taken root, and it was pulling them under. The fracturing of the mind. Xol'taq stepped forward. The macuital slipped from his grasp, clattering against the golden pavement. His muscles relaxed, his breathing slowed. Before him, in the reflection of the mirrored walls, he saw Xoltan, restored. His home. The temple city reborn, its pyramids gleaming beneath the sun, its canals full of crystal-clear water, its warriors standing proud in glistening ranks. And at the temple's peak, his reflection stood waiting for him, a younger version of himself, one untouched by battle, unburdened by war. Xol'taq moved toward it, his feet light, his steps sure. He was home. Krokai saw something different. He saw a world of endless battle, an arena filled with endless foes, a war that never stopped, never ceased, where his enemies fell in droves, but his strength never failed. His laughter rumbled as he stepped forward, ready to fight forever. Zanchai saw the stars. The universe unraveled before him, its secrets pouring into his mind, his golden eyes wide, his mouth murmuring ancient words, words that were not his own, knowledge that was not his to wield. Guanchi's shadow was nowhere. His vision had led him to a place beyond sight, a world of endless corridors, mirrors reflecting nothing but darkness. He walked endlessly, silently, and for the first time in his life, he was truly lost. Only Chaku remained aware. He saw the walls shift, saw the mirrors shimmer, saw the demon's laughter ripple like a knife through silk. He knew what he had to do. Breaking the illusion. Chaku raised his staff, channeling the will of the Old Ones, his frilled crest rising, his golden eyes burning with power. I see through you, trickster. I deny this place. I deny your lies. The ground rumbled. The streets trembled. The illusion shattered. Xol'taq's hand stopped inches from touching his younger reflection, only to see the truth. It was not himself he had been reaching for. It was a demon, its jagged teeth bared, its clawed hands reaching to drag him into the mirror's depths. Krokai's endless battlefield melted into a churning pit of flesh and fire, his enemies replaced by horrors with 1,000 grasping arms. Zanchai's celestial visions cracked, the knowledge in his mind turning into the shrieking of 1,000 maddened voices, his own skin splitting apart, glyphs burning into his flesh. And then it was gone. The city vanished. The Warband stood upon nothing. A black void of twisting colors, a realm of pure, shifting madness, the silver tower dissolving into mist, The demon, now a towering thing of roiling flesh and curling horns, its golden mask twisting into a cruel grin. Aha! So strong, but strength will not save you, little lizard. Fate has already woven your demise. Chaku thrust his staff forward, his power surging. The demon screeched, its form warping, unraveling, vanishing into the void, its laughter echoing even as it was torn away. The world lurched, snapping back, and the warband collapsed onto solid ground once more. The path ahead. They were back. The wastes stretched before them once more, the black spires of Xol'taq now truly visible in the distance. Xol'taq picked up his weapon, his breath slow and controlled, but his eyes dark with fury. Krokai shook his head, his teeth grinding, angry that he had been fooled. Zanchai was silent, his mind still buzzing with whispers of knowledge that did not belong to him. Wanche's shadow said nothing, but the way his eyes never stopped scanning the horizon spoke of a warrior who now trusted nothing, not even his own vision. Chaku exhaled, gripping his staff tight. They had won. But Tzeentch never played just one game. And the worst was still to come. Chapter 14. The Starborne's Fury. The Endless Horizon. Chaos Wastes. The warband trudged forward, their bodies weary, their minds scarred from the tricks of the Silver Tower. The air here was still, too still, a deathly hush stretched across the ashen dunes and broken lands. Even the winds of chaos, ever howling, seemed to cower in silence. It was as if the land itself held its breath, awaiting something terrible, something ancient. And then they felt it. Not an enemy, not a monster, but something greater, something that should not be here, something that had been waiting for them. The sky weeps light. A pulse rippled through the air, an unseen force pressing against their souls. A wave of celestial energy, so ancient, so vast, that even the chaos wastes recoiled. The skies above them fractured, the colors of madness parting as a beam of pure, searing blue-yike light tore through the heavens, splitting the sickly clouds like a blade through rotted flesh. Then, from the nothingness beyond, it descended. A massive, golden form, its body half-translucent, flickering like a flame in the wind. Its shape shifted between corporeal and ethereal, as if caught between the mortal plane and the world beyond. It was a Slan, but not a living one. A spirit, bound by forgotten magic, lost for eternity in this cursed place. The warband froze, their reptilian eyes wide, their instincts screaming reverence and dread. Then it spoke, its voice a tremor in the fabric of reality itself. You should not have come here. Xol'taq stepped forward, his jaw tight. We seek the Ouroboros of Eternity. The Slan's glowing eyes flickered, its body shifting, as if caught in a storm of cosmic forces. And so does he. A low rumble shook the earth, the ground trembling as the ghostly Slan raised a spectral hand. The air around them distorted, and the warband saw the vision of Xol'taq. The land cracked apart, and reality peeled away like torn parchment, revealing what lay beyond the veil of time. The warband saw Xol'taq as it once was, before the wastes consumed it, before it was forgotten. A city of colossal black monoliths, its architecture carved by the hands of the old ones themselves, its vast pyramids stretching into the sky, defying even the madness of chaos. And at its heart, the Ouroboros of Eternity, a ring of impossible power, its surface swirling with living constellations, its glyphs shifting, rearranging, whispering secrets that no mortal mind should comprehend. But the city was not empty. It was a battlefield. The vision twisted, time accelerating, showing an ancient war, a battle fought beyond mortal reckoning. They saw daemons, countless in number, surging against the walls of Xol'taq, their forms twisting and breaking, their claws scraping against the obsidian stone. They saw Slan, powerful and eternal, their minds united in celestial focus, unleashing storms of starfire that tore through the demonic ranks, incinerating hundreds in mere moments. And then he came. The coming of Xol'taq. The vision darkened, the stars above flickering, as a new figure entered the war. A towering form, its body ever shifting, a mass of writhing flesh, feathered wings, and golden sigils that burned with blasphemous power. Its face was hidden behind a mask of pure sapphire, its 4 arms crackling with untold sorcery, each hand weaving spells that reshaped reality with each motion. This was Xol'taq, the Daemon Prince of Tzeentch. The Slan unleashed their mightiest sorcery, the stars themselves bending to their will, cascading bolts of celestial destruction down upon the abomination. And Xol'taq laughed. He raised a single hand, and with it the laws of existence shattered. The Slan's magic withered, their spells unwoven before they could take form. The daemons, once held at bay, swarmed the city, breaching its hallowed walls, reducing its sacred halls to ruin, dragging the defenders into the abyss. The vision ended, the light collapsing inward, the ghostly Slan returning to its weakened form. It looked upon the Warband, its voice heavy with the weight of eternity. "You will not defeat him," Xol'taq growled, stepping forward. "We will. The Old Ones will it." The Slan's eyes narrowed. "Then know this, he has already arrived. He walks within the ruins, and he waits for you." The fury of the fallen. The Slan raised its hands, its form shuddering, flickering wildly as the very essence of chaos fought against its presence. "One gift remains. The power of the Starborn still lingers within me. Take it, and do not fail." A shock wave of energy erupted from the Slan's form, slamming into the Warband, filling their minds, their souls, their very blood with the power of the Old Ones. For a moment they saw beyond reality, glimpsing the paths of fate, the strands of destiny weaving around them. Then it was gone. The Slan's form faded, its strength spent, its presence finally succumbing to the wastes. Its final words whispered across the wind. "Go, the Ouroboros calls, and so does your doom." And then the Warband was alone once more. The ruins of Xol'taq loomed ahead, dark and waiting. And Xol'taq was there, watching. The final battle was near. And only one side would lead victorious. Chapter 15, Juan's Gambit. The blackened camp, outskirts of Xol'taq. The ruins of Xol'taq loomed in the distance, its obsidian towers jagged against the twisted sky, the Ouroboros of Eternity hidden somewhere within its forsaken depths. But between the Warband and their prize lay a horde of chaos. A war camp sprawled at the base of the ruins, its dark banners tattered in the unnatural winds, its fires burning with colors that had no name. The ground was scorched and barren, littered with bleached bones and rusted chains, the stench of blood and rot heavy in the air. Here, beasts of war, hulking mutants, twisted warriors, and chanting cultists gathered under the banners of Xol'taq, Daemon Prince of Tzeentch. The Warband watched from the cliffs above, hidden beneath the shadows of broken statues, their eyes scanning the camp of horrors below. "There are too many," Chaku whispered, his frilled crest bristling. "A direct assault would be folly." Xol'taq grunted, his claws tightening around his makuatil. "Then we carve our way through, one by one." Xoltan shook his head. "The path to the Ouroboros is unknown. Without a guide, we will wander its corridors until we are undone." Juan's shadow was silent. The chameleon skink watched unseen, his golden-ringed eyes fixed on the largest tent in the war camp, where the Chaos warlords gathered, their voices a low growl of guttural commands and mad laughter. There, atop a crude war table, sat a parchment of flayed human skin, etched with arcane glyphs and war markings. A map. The map they needed. Quan Chi's shadow exhaled slowly, his muscles coiling. "I will go. Alone." Tetzok's eyes flicked to him, unreadable. "The Warband cannot lose you now." Quan Chi's shadow only gave a faint hiss of amusement, already vanishing into the gloom. "Then I shall return." And then he was gone. The infiltration. Quan Chi's shadow melted into the darkness, his body blending into the ashen landscape, his every step soundless, every movement a ghost's whisper. The Chaos Warriors were too loud, too consumed with their own bloodlust and madness to notice the predator among them. He moved past hulking Chaos Warriors, their twisted forms wrapped in jagged armor, their faces hidden behind bladed helms, the stench of their breath thick with the scent of rot and madness. He slipped between mutant beasts, their bodies swollen with unnatural growths, their mouths full of too many teeth, their tongues licking at the air, searching for unseen prey. His golden eyes never blinked, never faltered. Only forward, only toward his prize. He reached the central tent, its fabric woven from flayed skin, its poles made of bones, its entrance guarded by two monstrous figures, a hulking Chaos Warrior, his arms lined with jagged blades, and a warped Sorcerer, his face a writhing mass of tentacles. Quan Chi studied them, his mind already calculating. A distraction. A single second is all I need. He reached into his belt, pulling a small vial of black liquid, a mixture of venom and stolen chaos blood, its stench rancid even to him. With a flick of his wrist, he hurled it into a nearby supply cart. The reaction was instantaneous. The vial burst into black fire, a corrupt explosion of energy, sending warriors reeling back, their armor melting, their bodies consumed by the screaming heat. The guards at the tent entrance turned, only for Quan Chi to slip past them, moving through the canvas flaps without a sound. The War Council. Inside, the air was thick with incense, the walls lined with demonic symbols that burned the eyes to look upon. A war council was underway. 3 Chaos Warlords stood around the war table, their forms twisted by the gifts of Tzeentch, their voices a blend of guttural growls and slithering whispers. "The Ouroboros is sealed, but not for long. Urzatar will breach its sanctum soon. The artifact will be his." "And what of the intruders, the reptiles?" One of the warlords let out a low chuckle, his voice like shattered glass. "Their corpses will feed the flames of the ever-changing god. None may oppose the changer's will." Guanche's shadow moved along the edges of the room, his form blurring, shifting, his very essence, bending the light around him, making him nothing but a breath of wind, a whisper in the dark. The map lay before him, marked with demonic glyphs, showing the true path to the Ouroboros, revealing hidden corridors, ancient seals, and the central sanctum where the artifact awaited. Quan Chi's fingers closed around it. Then a shudder ran through the tent, and one of the warlords turned, his eyes locked directly onto Quan Chi's invisible form. Thief. The illusion was broken. The escape. The tent exploded into motion. The first warlord lunged, his clawed hands slicing through the air, but Quan Chi was faster, twisting aside, his daggers flashing as he slashed across the Chaos Warrior's exposed throat. A spray of black blood erupted, but the warlord did not fall, his wound sealing itself instantly, his laughter echoing through the chamber. "Did you think I would die so easily, little thing?" The others drew weapons, one unleashing a torrent of blue fire, the other summoning demonic blades from the void itself. Quan Chi moved. He was not here to fight. He was here to escape. With a flick of his wrist, he hurled a handful of black powder into the air, a concoction of jungle spores and alchemical toxins, creating a blinding mist of choking vapor. The Chaos Warriors howled, their vision blurred, their movements sluggish as the poison seeped into their lungs. Juan tore through the tent's back wall, vanishing into the darkness beyond. The camp was in chaos, warriors rushing toward the fire, others grabbing weapons, their war cries shaking the night. But Juan was already gone. By the time the first warriors reached the war tent, all that remained was the echo of laughter on the wind. The Warband's next step. Juan's shadow returned to the cliffs, the map clutched tight in his claws. The Warband turned as he approached, their eyes questioning. He unfurled the stolen parchment, the markings revealing the true path through Xol'taq, the way to the Ouroboros. Xol'taq nodded, his golden eyes flashing with purpose. Then we move. We end this, now. Ahead, the black ruins of Xol'taq awaited. And so did Xoltan. Chapter 16. The Siege of the Forgotten City. The Gates of Xol'taq, a city drowned in chaos. The ruins of Xol'taq stretched before them, a once glorious temple city now consumed by madness and war. What had once been a bastion of the Old Ones, a place of celestial order and divine purpose, was now a rotting carcass of stone and corruption. The great pyramids, once crowned with golden glyphs, were now defiled, their surfaces etched with demonic sigils, their holy altars blackened with the blood of sacrifices. The streets writhed with unholy abominations, warped chaos warriors, their bodies twisted by the dark gods, their armor fused to pulsing mutated flesh. Between them moved horrors of the warp, writhing demons that bled light and shadow, their forms constantly shifting, their whispers pressing against the very fabric of reality. At the heart of the doomed city, the greatest temple of Xol'taq stood tall, its entrance flanked by colossal obsidian statues of the Old Ones, now cracked, weeping black ichor, their faces scarred beyond recognition. Within that temple lay the Ouroboros of Eternity, and at its peak, waiting, was Xoltan, the demon prince of Tzeentch. The Warband stood atop a nearby ridge, scanning the city below. The odds were impossible, but they did not falter. Xol'taq's clawed hand tightened around his makuahuitl. We take the city. We kill everything inside. We end this. Crokea snorted, his massive fists flexing. Finally, a real fight. Chaku raised his staff, his eyes glowing with celestial wisdom. The city's heart must be cleansed, or chaos will claim it forever. We must be swift. Juan's shadow did not speak. He was already gone, slipping into the darkness below. The siege of Xol'taq had begun. The first assault. The Warband descended, using the cover of darkness and the ruined terrain to move through the outskirts of the city. Their first target was the outer patrols, mutated warriors clad in cracked, bladed armor, their eyes glowing with demonic fire, their bodies half human, half monstrosity. They never saw their killers. Juan's shadow moved first, striking from the darkness, his daggers silencing throats before screams could escape. One by one the patrols collapsed, their corpses twitching in pools of blackened blood, their souls stolen before the warp could reclaim them. Xol'taq led the charge into the streets, his makuahuitl ripping through chaos warriors, shattering skulls, severing arms, spilling entrails onto the sacred stones. Crokea waded through the slaughter, his massive war maul caving in torsos, his clawed hands gripping enemy skulls and crushing them into pulp. Xoltan called upon the heavens, and from above, the sky split open, bolts of pure starfire cascading down, reducing mutants and demons alike to nothing but screaming, flickering ash. The outer defenses fell within moments. But the true horror was yet to come. The daemonic horde. A roar echoed through the city, a sound that shattered stone, that warped the air itself. The ground split open, and from its depths crawled the true horrors of the warp. A tide of Tzeentchian demons, horrors, screamers, and things that had no names, slithered from the fissures, their bodies shifting between solid and mist, their voices a cacophony of mocking whispers and maddened screams. They did not charge. They flowed, a wave of impossible flesh and nightmare, their claws dripping with ethereal fire, their eyes filled with a hunger older than time itself. Xol'taq bared his fangs, his muscles coiling. "Hold the line. Do not break. Kill them all." The warband stood firm, and the slaughter began again. The streets run red. Xol'taq tore through the front line, his makuahitl shattering demonic bodies, his claws ripping through flesh that was not flesh, his armor stained with the blood of things that should not bleed. But the demons did not fall like mortal foes. Their wounds burned shut, their limbs regrew, their laughter filled the air as they reformed again and again, mocking their would-be killers. Prokai fought like a beast, his maul swinging in brutal arcs, crushing horrors into flickering shadows, smashing through the lines of the ever-shifting enemy. Chaku unleashed his magic, weaving barriers of celestial force, shattering warp-born entities with divine fury, his voice ringing with the will of the Old Ones. Juan's shadow was everywhere and nowhere, his daggers carving through demon flesh, his poisons burning through otherworldly veins, his movements a blur of death. The streets became a war zone, a maelstrom of flashing weapons, surging magic, and the dying screams of the unworthy. The ground was slick with unnatural gore, the air thick with the scent of burning chaos, and still they fought on. The warband pushed deeper, cutting their way through the nightmare, their bodies aching, their minds on the brink of breaking. And then, at last, they reached the temple gates. The final stand. The great doors of the temple loomed before them, their surfaces blackened with corruption, the sacred glyphs of the Old Ones overwritten with blasphemous runes. And upon the temple steps, waiting, was the final wall of defense. A ring of chaos champions, their bodies warped by daemonic power, their armor fused to their flesh, their weapons glowing with the light of a false god. They were not like the others. They did not charge blindly. They did not shriek with madness. They were calm, their eyes filled not with fury, but purpose. The warband halted, their breath ragged, their weapons dripping with the blood of 100 foes. One of the champions stepped forward, his voice calm, knowing, mocking. "You are too late, lizard things. Urzathar awaits. The Ouroboros is his. Your fate is already written." Xol'taq growled, his claws flexing. "Then we will rewrite it in your blood." The Chaos Warriors raised their weapons. The warband readied themselves once more. And then, with a single roar of defiance, they charged once more into the abyss. The temple's doors stood open before them. Inside, Xol'taq waited. The war for the Ouroboros of Eternity had reached its final chapter. Chapter 17. The First Betrayal. The Corruption of a Priest. The warband had breached the temple gates. The battle outside still raged, but inside, the darkness was deeper, the air heavier, the very fabric of reality warped by sorcery. The temple's walls, once pristine slabs of obsidian, were now pulsing with veins of unnatural light, living flesh fused with stone, shifting in grotesque, impossible patterns. The glyphs of the Old Ones had been defiled, their sacred geometry overridden with Tzeentchian sigils, twisting and rearranging when looked at for too long. The scent of burning incense and rotten meat filled the air, thick and suffocating. But it was not just the temple that had changed. Xoltan had changed too. The seeds of chaos bloom. For days the whispers had been creeping into his mind, ever since they had entered the Chaos Wastes. Soft at first, gentle murmurs promising knowledge. But now, inside the heart of the corruption, they were deafening. Look at them, Xoltan. They do not understand. They never did. You are the only one who can see. The old ones left you here to die. But I can show you the way. He staggered, his head pounding, his golden eyes flaring with unnatural light. He could see beyond time now, beyond the fabric of existence. He could see the paths of fate, but they were all wrong. The Ouroboros does not belong to them, Xoltan. It belongs to you. He clutched his staff, his hands trembling. He had always served the old ones, their will his only guide, but where were they now? Where was Xol'taq, his master? Where were the gods he had given his life to? Go on. But the whispers remained. They had never abandoned him. And suddenly he knew what he had to do. The betrayal. The Warband pressed deeper into the temple's labyrinth, their forms illuminated by the eerie glow of the cursed stone. The deeper they went, the more the corridors twisted, shifting like a living thing, guiding them toward the Ouroboros sanctum. Tetzuk led the way, his makuoitl clutched tight, his every step heavy with determination. Kurkai was silent, his massive fists flexing, his breath ragged from the battle outside. Huanshi's shadow moved unseen, his golden eyes flicking between the shadows, waiting for an ambush that would never come. Chaku muttered prayers, sensing a sickness in the air. Something wrong, something unnatural. And then Xoltan stopped walking. Tetzuk turned, his slit-pupilled eyes narrowing. "What are you doing? Keep moving." Xoltan's laughter echoed through the corridor, low and strange, wrong in ways that sent a shiver through the group. "You do not understand, do you, old blood? None of you do." He turned to face them, his golden eyes now bleeding with sickly blue light, the mark of Tsench carved into his brow, burned there by his own hand. "The old ones left us to die. They abandoned this world long ago. But I have seen what lies beyond the stars. I have seen the true will of eternity. The Ouroboros belongs to me." Tetzuk's grip on his weapon tightened. "You were one of us." Xoltan grinned, his expression filled with both sorrow and madness. "And now I am more." Then he attacked. The Warband's deadliest battle. Xoltan raised his staff, and the walls erupted with warp fire, great waves of crackling blue flame rushing through the corridor. The Warband scattered, barely avoiding the incinerating blast, the heat scorching their scales, burning their flesh. Kurkai roared, lunging forward, swinging his war maul in a brutal arc. Xoltan moved too fast, his body warping, shifting, stepping through space itself, reappearing behind Kurkai, a dagger of pure sorcery forming in his hand. "Goodbye, old friend." He stabbed deep, the blade sinking between Kurkai's ribs, the magic twisting within his flesh, his veins blackening instantly. Kurkai staggered, his massive form collapsing, his eyes rolling back as corruption spread through his body. Tetzuk roared in fury, charging forward, his makuoitl swinging in a deadly arc. Xoltan raised his staff, blocking the strike, the obsidian blades grinding against the enchanted wood. The two warriors clashed, each strike shattering stone, their battle a blur of divine might and dark sorcery. But Tetzuk was a warrior born, a creature forged in battle, a veteran of 1,000 wars. And Xoltan had forgotten that. Tetzuk saw his opening, a twist of the wrist, a shift in his stance, a single feint. And then the makuoitl struck true. The obsidian teeth tore through Xoltan's chest, ripping through flesh and bone, a shower of golden blood splattering against the corrupted stone. Xoltan gasped, his breath ragged, his hands clutching at the gaping wound, his eyes wide with pain and realization. I only wanted to see." Tetzok's expression was cold. Then see no more. With one final swing, the Machuitl fell, severing Zanchai's head from his body. The light in his golden eyes flickered. Then he was gone. Aftermath. Silence fell upon the warband. Chaku knelt beside Krokai, placing his hands on the massive warrior's wound, chanting the words of the Old Ones, trying to purge the corruption before it consumed him. Huenche's shadow stood motionless, his eyes locked on Zanchai's lifeless corpse, the betrayal still fresh, still raw. Tetzok wiped his blade clean, his face impassive, but in his heart he felt the weight of another loss. They had come so far, and chaos had already begun to claim them. They had won this fight. But at what cost? With no words left to speak, the warband moved forward. The temple's inner sanctum awaited. The Ouroboros lay just ahead, and Urzathar was waiting for them. Chapter 18. Trial of the Old Ones. The Sanctum of Eternity, Temple Core, Excarathles. The warband moved in silence, their steps echoing through the hollow corridors of the temple, their bodies weary from battle, their minds scarred from betrayal. Zanchai's corpse lay behind them, a reminder of how deep chaos had sunk its claws into their journey. But now none of that mattered. The sanctum awaited. At the end of the great obsidian hallway, an ancient doorway towered before them, its massive stone frame lined with glyphs of the Old Ones, untouched by the corruption that had consumed the rest of the city. It was a barrier of divine will, pure and untainted. And beyond it, the Ouroboros of Eternity? Tetzok placed a clawed hand against the stone, feeling the hum of ancient power pulsing beneath his fingers. This is it. Chaku raised his staff, his frilled crest rising, sensing the magic woven into the threshold. We have come far, but the Old Ones do not give their gifts freely. We will be tested. Huanqi's shadow stared at the door, his golden eyes flickering. Then we survive. Like always. Tetzok pressed forward, and with a deep, grinding tremor, the doorway split open, revealing the trial of the Old Ones. The descent into judgment. The warband stepped forward, and the moment they crossed the threshold, the world vanished. The walls of obsidian and stone dissolved, replaced by a vast cosmic expanse, a realm of infinite stars and shifting constellations, where time and space bled together like paint on water. They stood on nothing and everything, their bodies weightless, yet anchored, their senses stretching beyond mortal understanding. Then the Old Ones spoke. "Who among you is worthy?" The voice was not one, but many, layered upon itself, each word carrying the weight of divine purpose. And suddenly, the warband was torn apart. Each warrior found themselves alone, separated from their kin, forced to face the trial alone. Tetzok's trial, the soul of a warrior. Tetzok stood atop a pyramid of endless height, its steps slick with the blood of fallen foes, its summit lost in the void of the stars above. And at the peak, his final enemy awaited. Himself. The reflection of his soul stepped forward, a perfect copy, but drenched in the blood of the past, its scales darker, its golden eyes burning with cold indifference. You believe you are a warrior of the Old Ones, but you are nothing but a killer, a beast, a creature of war, no different from those you slay. Tetzok bared his fangs, gripping his Machuitl tight. Then I will prove you wrong. The battle began. They clashed with feral intensity, obsidian blades screaming as they met in a shower of sparks and blood. Blow for blow, strike for strike, neither yielded. But the truth came, in whispers. Every warrior he had ever killed, every battle he had fought, they whispered in his mind, clawing at his soul, calling him a monster, a murderer, a tool of war that would never find peace. His reflection laughed, his voice mocking. What will you do when the war is over, Xol'taq? When there is nothing left to kill? For a moment he hesitated, and in that moment his reflection struck deep, its blade sinking into his chest, twisting with a sickening crunch. Xol'taq staggered, the pain searing, his breath ragged. And then he understood. He had never fought for war itself. He had never fought for himself. He fought for the Old One's will, and that meant he would always have purpose. With a roar he drove his own blade forward, shattering the illusion, banishing his doubt. He had passed the trial. Chakta's trial, the faith of the devout. Chaku knelt before a colossal throne, where a great Slann Mage-Priest sat, its body shrouded in golden mist, its eyes two burning suns. It studied him, its voice carrying the weight of eternity itself. "Do you still believe?" Chaku felt his heart tremble. The memories of Zanchai's betrayal, the horrors they had seen, the whispers of chaos, they pressed against him, eroding the faith he had always carried. "The Old Ones are gone. We have been forsaken. You have no gods left to pray to. What is left of your faith?" Chaku clenched his fists. "I do not pray for salvation. I do not pray for reward. I serve because it is right." The Slan raised its hand, and suddenly Chaku was drowning. He was sinking into an endless ocean, its depths filled with whispering voices, pulling him down, demanding him to let go, to give in. His lungs burned, his vision fading, but then, deep within, he felt it. A light. The will of the Old Ones, eternal and unyielding. With a final desperate cry, he rose above the waters breaking free, gasping as the throne room returned. The Slan's eyes dimmed, its voice now soft. "Then you are worthy." And the trial ended. Huan Chi's Shadow's trial. The judgment of the hunter. Huan Chi's shadow stood in endless darkness, the void stretching in every direction, a hunter lost in an abyss without prey, without purpose. Then they emerged. 1,000 golden eyes flickered in the dark. The Old Ones, hunters, their forms woven from the essence of the hunt itself, their presence overwhelming. They spoke as one. "You kill in silence, you kill from the dark, but do you kill for them, or for yourself?" Huan Cha did not answer. Instead, he drew his blades. "Then prove your loyalty, hunter. Prove you are not just another beast lurking in the shadows." The golden-eyed forms attacked, their movements swift and silent, their blades flashing like lightning. Huan Chi fought like a ghost, dodging, striking, twisting through the storm of blades, his daggers dripping with the ichor of the hunted. He did not fight for himself. He fought for the Old Ones. And when the last enemy fell, the golden eyes dimmed, and a single voice spoke. "Then you are one of us." And the trial was complete. The final gate. The Warband awoke, the celestial expanse collapsing around them, their bodies returning to the real world. Before them, at the heart of the temple, the Ouroboros of Eternity hovered, its golden rings spinning slowly, filled with power beyond understanding. They had passed the trial of the Old Ones. But outside, Urzathar was waiting. The final battle was near, and only one side would claim the Ouroboros. Chapter 19. The Demon Prince's Wrath. The heart of Xol'taq, the Ouroboros awakens. The Ouroboros of Eternity hovered in the air before them, a colossal golden ring, its surface alive with shifting glyphs, pulsing with an immeasurable power. The Warband had passed the trial of the Old Ones, their bodies still aching from the ordeal, their minds scarred but unbroken. Xol'taq reached out a clawed hand, his fingers brushing the surface of the artifact. And the world split apart. A scream erupted from the heavens, a sound that shattered stone, that rippled through the walls of the temple, sending cracks crawling across the floor like veins of doom. The air burned. The ceiling above them twisted and melted, its surface becoming a vortex of black fire, and from it a form descended, a massive shape of ever-changing flesh, its 4 great wings stretching wide, its mask of pure sapphire gleaming with cold, cosmic intelligence. Xoltan had arrived. The demon prince of Tzeentch floated above them, his body shifting constantly, his limbs elongating and contracting, his hands crackling with magic woven from the raw essence of chaos itself. His mask held no expression, yet his presence oozed with contempt and amusement. You thought you could steal what belongs to the changer of ways? You thought you could challenge the will of Tzeentch? His voice was a chorus of 1,000 whispers, a storm of overlapping words spoken in languages long forgotten. Tetzok gritted his fangs, raising his makuhuaitl, his golden eyes burning with defiance. The Ouroboros does not belong to you, demon. Xoltan's mask tilted, his form shuddering with laughter that echoed across reality itself. Oh, but it does. And then the war began. The battle for the Ouroboros. The room erupted into chaos as Xoltan descended, his 4 arms raised, weaving sigils of impossible power into the air. A storm of eldritch fire exploded from his fingertips, crashing into the warband like a tidal wave of pure madness. Tetzok rolled aside, barely dodging the searing blast, the heat scorching the stone where he had stood only moments before. Brokai charged, his war maul raised high, his massive bulk moving with shocking speed, his roar shaking the temple walls. Xoltan merely tilted his head, and with a flick of one of his hands, a wave of kinetic force slammed into the Kroxigger, sending him hurtling backward, his massive body crashing into an ancient pillar, shattering it on impact. Chaku raised his staff, his voice ringing with celestial incantations, summoning a column of divine energy from the heavens. The light struck Xoltan's form, his flesh sizzling, his wings seared, but instead of pain, the demon prince merely laughed, his form splitting into 3 separate versions of himself, each moving independently, each preparing a different spell. One raised a hand, sending ribbons of pure shadow toward Chaku, coiling around his throat, lifting him into the air as he choked and convulsed. Quan Chi's shadow appeared from nowhere, his daggers flashing, his strikes aimed directly for the demon's throat. But before the blades could land, Xoltan vanished, and in an instant, Quan Chi found himself standing in another part of the temple, as if he had never moved at all. Pathetic, insignificant things. You are mortal. You are dust upon the winds of eternity. And I am the storm. Xoltan raised both hands, and the temple itself warped, the ground splitting apart, revealing a chasm of endless void beneath them, filled with screaming faces, grasping hands, souls trapped in eternal torment. Let me show you your fate. And then he descended upon them like a god of destruction. Tetzok's last stand. Tetzok met the charge head-on, his makuitl swinging with primal fury, obsidian teeth tearing through Xoltan's shifting flesh, black ichor splattering onto the temple floor. For the first time the demon flinched. Tetzok pressed the attack, striking again and again, his mind a furnace of rage, his heart boiling with the will of the old ones. Die, filth! Xoltan snarled, his mask cracking slightly, his wings beating furiously, sending a shock wave of raw force that hurled Tetzok backward. The old blood landed hard, his body slamming against the shattered temple stones, his bones fracturing under the impact. He tried to rise, but before he could, Xoltan was upon him, his taloned hand piercing through Tetzok's chest, driving deep, clenching around his beating heart. Tetzok gasped, blood pouring from his mouth, his vision darkening. The demon prince leaned close, his voice a whisper of mocking pity. And thus ends the last great warrior of the old ones. He squeezed. But before he could finish, a blast of celestial fire struck him in the side, searing his arm, forcing him to release his grip. Chaku stood tall, his body glowing with the light of the Old Ones, his voice shaking the foundations of the temple itself. "Will not die today." Wanchi's shadow appeared behind Xoltan, his blade sinking deep into the daemon's exposed flesh, twisting, releasing poisons harvested from the depths of Lustria's deadliest jungles. Xoltan roared in fury, his form shuddering, his wings beating violently as he reeled back, momentarily stunned. Krokai rose from the rubble, his eyes filled with fire, his maul cracking against the demon prince's ribs, sending a shock wave of power through the chamber. The tide was turning. But Xoltan was dying. Blood poured from his chest, his strength fading, his vision swimming. Chaku rushed to his side, pressing glowing hands against the wound, chanting the prayers of the Old Ones. But even he knew the wound was mortal. Xoltan gritted his teeth, his golden eyes burning even as his strength drained away. Kill the demon. Do not let him. Take the Ouroboros. The warband turned to face Xoltan once more. The demon prince rose, his body burning, his rage unfathomable. "You will all die here. The Oroborus belongs to Tzeentch." The final battle had begun, and only one side would walk away. Chapter 20. The Oroborus Claimed. The heart of the temple. Xol'taq. Xol'taq lay dying, his blood pooling across the ancient stone floor, his once unstoppable body failing, the wound in his chest, a mortal brand left by the talons of Xoltan. The Warbands stood around him, their bodies battered, their souls on the brink of despair. The demon prince of Tzeentch towering before them, his great wings smoldering with celestial fire, his mask cracked but unbroken. The Ouroboros of Eternity still hovered above them, its golden form spinning, shifting, waiting, its power untamed and unclaimed. But Xoltan would not allow them to take it. The demon prince's voice was a storm, a cascade of incomprehensible words and shrieking echoes, his rage now limitless, his power unshackled. "You think you can steal from the changer of ways? You are nothing. Your gods are dead. Your world is already mine." He raised all four arms, weaving sigils of impossible complexity, his wounds already sealing, his form swelling, growing ever more horrific, ever more monstrous. Reality fractured around him, the temple walls stretching, warping, the chamber transforming into a twisted nightmare of floating ruins and void light, a place where time unraveled and the laws of existence were abandoned. The Warband had only one chance, and it came not from them, but from beyond. The spirit of Xol'taq. The air trembled, and suddenly a light, ancient and pure, tore through the corruption. A deep, resonant hum filled the chamber, one that silenced the demon's laughter, one that shook the very foundation of chaos itself. From the void of the temple's depths, a figure emerged. A colossal golden form, wreathed in ethereal mist, its body half real, half energy, floating above the battlefield like a god untouched by time. Xol'taq, the Slann Mage-Priest. Though long dead, his will had endured, bound to this temple, anchored to the very stones that once housed the power of the Old Ones. The Slan's eyes burned with starfire, his massive hands raised in divine command, his voice a force beyond reckoning. "Be gone. Creature of lies, your will holds no power here." Xoltan screeched, his wings flaring, his form distorting as the light of the Old One's servant clashed against his unholy essence. The demon prince lashed out, his talons surging forward, his magic twisting into a cascade of unmaking tendrils of pure chaos seeking to rip the Slan's soul apart. But Xol'taq was beyond such things. With a single terrible word, a shockwave erupted, a blast of golden light that rippled across the battlefield, banishing the corruption, forcing Xoltan back, searing into his dwarf flesh. The demon staggered, his form cracking, his power weakened. No, this cannot be. The old ones are gone. They are gone. Zock's gaze lowered, filled with cosmic judgment. There will endures. And it is not your time. He turned to Chaku, the last skink priest of his lineage, his voice now gentle, yet filled with undeniable command. Seal him, banish him. Use the Ouroboros, it is your duty. Chaku understood. He turned to the Ouroboros, his hands trembling, his body weakened, yet his soul now clearer than it had ever been. The ring of eternity called to him, the ancient power of the old ones waiting to be claimed once more. And so, with a final breath, he reached for it. The sealing of Xoltan. The moment Chaku's fingers closed around the Ouroboros, the temple ignited with celestial energy, a great pulse of golden fire surging through the chamber, flooding the world with the raw might of the old ones. The artifact whirled in his grasp, the glyphs upon its surface rearranging, activating a power not seen in an age. Chaku turned, his frilled crest burning with divine radiance, his voice shaking with the weight of fate itself. Gigon Yusadar, your will is broken. You are not welcome in this goal. The Ouroboros erupted, its rings expanding, growing larger and larger, its glyphs spinning in a spiral of infinite complexity, and then it collapsed inward, a vortex of pure celestial force forming in the chamber's core. Xoltan screamed, his body unraveling, his form buckling under the impossible force of the Old One's judgment. No, no, I cannot fall. Ziche, I beg you. I have served you faithfully, His pleas went unheard. The Ouroboros sealed itself, its golden light swallowing the demon prince whole, dragging him into the endless cycle of eternity, into a prison that would never break, never weaken, never fail. His body disintegrated, his voice faded, and with a final, agonizing howl, Xoltan was gone. The cost of victory. Silence fell. The Warbands stood amidst the ruins of the battle, their bodies shaken, their minds reeling. But the cost had been great. Xoltan lay motionless, his chest rising and falling in ragged, uneven breaths, the light in his golden eyes flickering. Chaku rushed to him, but the moment he placed his hands upon the wound, he knew. Is not long for this world. Xoltan's clawed hand weakly grasped Chaku's arm, his voice a harsh whisper. You did well. The old ones would be proud. Chaku closed his eyes, his heart aching with grief, but he did not allow himself to weep. Huanchi's shadow knelt beside Xoltan, his face hidden, unreadable. Kai clenched his fists, his massive form trembling, his usual stoicism shattered. Xoltan managed a final breath, his eyes upon the Oroborus, now sealed, now safe. It is done. And then his hand fell still. The greatest warrior of their kind was gone. And in the silence that followed, the Warband knew their journey was not yet over. The Ouroboros of Eternity was now theirs. But the war was far from finished, and new trials awaited them beyond the horizon. Chapter 21. The warp is unstable. The collapse begins. Temple core. Exculathes. The demon prince was gone. The Ouroboros of Eternity was in their possession. But victory had come at a terrible cost. Xoltan lay dead, his body still, his golden eyes forever dimmed. The Warbands stood over him, their breath ragged, their bodies battered and broken, but there was no time for mourning. The moment Xoltan was sealed, the temple began to scream, not with a voice, not with sound, but with the wailing of reality itself. The walls trembled, their surfaces melting and reforming, ancient glyphs unraveling into streams of luminous dust. The sky above cracked open, revealing impossible shapes, vistas of madness that no mortal mind could comprehend. Xol'taq was dying, and if they did not leave now, they would die with it. "The warp is unraveling. We must move now," Chaku yelled, his voice barely cutting through the storm of collapsing reality. The warband turned and ran. Escape through a dying city. They sprinted through the shifting corridors, their steps unsteady as the ground buckled beneath them, rising and falling as though it were breathing its last. Behind them, the center of the temple tore open, a great void of swirling colors and shrieking light, its maw hungry, devouring everything in its path. Krokai roared, slamming his war maul into a crumbling wall, clearing a path through the falling debris, his massive form bulldozing forward, crushing anything that threatened to block their way. Wanchi's shadow darted ahead, his body blurring, moving faster than sight, leaping from crumbling stone to crumbling stone, scanning for the fastest way out. "The outer bridge, it's still standing," he called. Chaku gripped the Ouroboros tightly, feeling the artifact pulse with raw power, as if it too was struggling against the collapse. They reached the outer hall, the once sacred corridor now a twisted nightmare, its pillars warping into grotesque twisting spines, its murals of the old ones dissolving into faces that wept black ichor. "Do not stop," Kashto warned. A section of the ceiling split open, revealing a maelstrom of horrors, a sea of writhing, demonic shapes, their clawed hands reaching through the gaps of broken reality, their eyes endless spirals of madness, their voices a mocking chorus of suffering. They were trapped between two deaths, the collapse of the temple and the monsters clawing their way through the veil of reality itself. Wanchi's shadow moved first, vanishing in a blur, reappearing behind one of the demons, his blade slicing through its throat before it could react. Its screeching death cry was short-lived, but the others felt the scent of blood and rushed forward. Krokai met them head-on, his massive fists swinging like wrecking balls, crushing one demon's skull, sending its body flailing into the abyss below. Another leapt onto his back, jagged talons sinking into his flesh, but the Kroxagor simply reached over his shoulder, grabbed the creature by the throat, and snapped its neck with a single squeeze. Chaku summoned a wave of starfire, incinerating 3 demons mid-lunge, their forms twisting into melting wax, their screams vanishing into the howling storm. They pushed forward, dodging falling debris, avoiding the cracks in reality, fighting against the impossible distortions of time and space, their bodies bending and stretching unnaturally as the warp thrashed in its death throes. Then they saw it, the bridge leading out of the city. But it was already falling apart. The final sprint. The Great Bridge of Xol'taq, once a sacred pathway leading from the temple's heart to the outer ruins, was now a crumbling ruin, its once pristine obsidian cracked and buckling, chunks of it disappearing into the void below. The warband had seconds to cross. Krokai went first, his massive form thundering across the bridge, stone shattering under his weight, each step a gamble between survival and freefall. Wanchi's shadow moved like a ghost, leaping across the widening gaps, his claws gripping unstable stone, using the falling debris as stepping stones. Chaku struggled to keep up, the Ouroboros burning in his hands, its weight immense, its power resisting, as if it desired to stay, to anchor itself to this dying place. Behind them, the temple's core exploded, a shockwave of warp energy surging forward, consuming everything in its path. Jump, now! Krokai reached the other side, his massive form landing in a roll, the impact cratering the stone beneath him. Wanchi landed beside him, turning back. Chaku was falling. The bridge beneath him shattered, his body plunging into the abyss. No, Quan Chi reacted instantly, his tail whipping forward, his clawed hands shooting out, grabbing Chaku's arm mid-fall, his daggers plunging into the edge of the bridge, anchoring them both. For a moment, time froze. The warp storm surged forward, the dead city breaking apart, the temple vanishing into a void of ruin and lost history. And then, with a final desperate pull, Quan Chi hauled Chaku up, both of them rolling onto solid ground as the last remnants of Xol'taq collapsed into oblivion. The shockwave hit, sending them skidding across the ground, dust and debris filling the air. Then, silence. The city was gone. The temple was no more. And the Ouroboros was theirs. The cost of survival. Chaku sat up first, clutching the artifact, his hands shaking, his body burning with exhaustion. Quan Chi lay beside him, his breathing heavy, his blades still clutched tight, his instincts refusing to release them even now. Crokai rolled onto his back, staring at the sky, his massive chest heaving, his armor cracked, his flesh torn, but alive. For a long time none of them spoke. Then Chaku looked around. Tetsuc was not with them. His body had been left behind in the temple, lost in the collapse of the city, his remains now buried beneath the ruins of Xol'taq, forever entombed with the enemies he had slain. He had died a warrior's death. Chaku clenched his fists, holding the Ouroboros close, feeling its power hum against his chest, the reality of their mission's success drowning under the weight of their loss. He should be here, Crokai grunted. He always will be. The wind howled, the sky clearing, the nightmare of the warp receding, leaving behind only the wreckage of their war. The Warband had survived, but victory had never felt so hollow. And the Ouroboros was only the beginning. Chapter 22. Chaku's Sacrifice. The Flight from the Wastes. A Hunt Without Mercy. The Warband did not stop running. The collapse of Xol'taq had left behind nothing but a smoldering crater, an abyss where a great city once stood, now swallowed by the chaos it had tried to defy. But the wastes were not done with them. As they fled, they could feel it, the corruption, the wrath, the sheer will of chaos refusing to let them leave unpunished. And then the ground began to tremble. A new horror was coming. The Pursuer, a greater demon's wrath. A deep guttural roar split the sky, louder than thunder, a sound that shook the very bones of the world. The Warband turned, and there, rising from the ruins of Xol'taq, was the nightmare given flesh. A greater demon of Tzeentch. It was colossal, a towering amalgamation of shifting limbs, its wings stretching across the sky, blotting out the light, its body twisted constantly, its limbs appearing and disappearing, its face ever-changing, shifting between 100 screaming visages, each one writhing with intelligence, madness, and unrelenting hatred. It did not speak. It simply moved, its talons outstretched, its wings beating against the storm, its presence warping reality itself. It was not hunting them out of instinct. It was vengeance incarnate. It had been sent by Tzeentch himself, and it would not stop until they were dead. The desperate escape. Run! Crokai needed no order, his massive form surging forward, each stride crushing the brittle ground, his breath coming in furious, ragged huffs. Unchi's shadow moved like a ghost, his form barely visible, leaping between shattered stones, vanishing into every wisp of darkness he could find, never stopping, never hesitating. Chaku clutched the Ouroboros to his chest, feeling its immense power, its glyphs whispering, promising him something he could not yet understand. The sky was breaking apart behind them, light and shadow folding inward as the greater demon gained ground, moving impossibly fast, its body shifting in and out of existence, a living storm of sorcery and vengeance. They had no chance of outrunning it. They had only one option. Someone had to stay behind, and Chaku knew it had to be him. The final decision. Chaku skidded to a halt, his body turning, his hands gripping his staff, his golden eyes burning with realization. Go, now. Crokai stopped mid-stride, turning back, his massive teeth bared. No. We fight together. Chaku shook his head, stepping back toward the oncoming nightmare, his frilled crest rising, his eyes filled with a calm that should not have been possible. We cannot kill it, we cannot stop it, but I can delay it. I can banish it. Huan Chai's shadow stepped forward, his golden eyes flickering with understanding, and for the first time, something almost like hesitation. There must be another way. Chaku smiled, something soft, something sad. There is none. This is my duty. The old ones will it. You must live to carry the Ouroboros back to Lustria. That is the only path forward. Crokai snarled, his massive hands clenching, his rage warring with the truth. But they all knew. There was no time to argue. The greater demon was upon them. Go, now, or my death will mean nothing. Crokai's fists shook. Then, without another word, he turned and ran. Huan Chi lingered for only a second, his expression hidden in shadow. Then he vanished into the mist. And Chaku was alone. The last stand. The greater demon descended, its great wings beating, its many mouths chanting unspeakable incantations, its clawed hands forming glyphs that bent the very fabric of reality itself. Chaku raised the Ouroboros, feeling its immense power, its unstoppable potential, and in that moment he understood what had to be done. This was not an artifact of war. It was an artifact of order. It was a weapon against chaos itself. Chaku began the incantation, his voice rising, speaking in the ancient tongue of the old ones, words that had not been spoken for millennia, a prayer that could unmake a creature of the warp. You are a corruption upon this world. You do not belong. I banish you in the name of the old ones. You will return to the void. You will return to nothing. The Ouroboros erupted with golden fire, its rings spinning wildly, its glyphs shining with the fury of lost gods. The greater demon shrieked, its form contorting, warping, as the very laws of reality rejected it, the power of the old ones rejecting its existence outright. It lashed out, its talons slashing into Chaku's chest, ripping through flesh and bone, sending blood splattering across the altar stones. Chaku gasped, his body trembling, but his hands never wavered, his chant never faltered. Return, be agone. The Ouroboros pulsed, sending out a final cataclysmic surge of power, a wave of golden radiance that tore through the demon's form, shattering its flesh, its mind, its very essence. It screamed, its body disintegrating, its wings folding inward, its many faces shrieking as they imploded, its presence ripped from reality. And then silence. Chaku collapsed to his knees, his vision fading, his breath shallow. His hands, once strong, were now soaked in his own blood. He felt nothing but peace. The Ouroboros was safe. The Warband had escaped. And as he looked up at the darkening sky, he saw the faint, golden vision of Xol'taq, watching over him, waiting for him, beyond the veil of time. I have done my duty. I have served the old ones. His breath slowed. His eyes closed. And Chaku, priest of the old ones, guardian of the Oroboros, keeper of faith, was no more. The survivors, Crokai and Huan Chi, ran through the endless ruins, their bodies still aching, their minds still reeling. But they did not stop. They could not stop. Behind them, the sky was empty. The demon was gone. But so was Chaku. Huan Chi's shadow turned his gaze downward, his voice barely a whisper. We leave too many behind. Crokai said nothing. His grief was silent, his fists clenching until his knuckles cracked. The Ouroboros was theirs. But now, there were only 2 left to carry it home. Chapter 23. The Sinking City. A fading memory in the wastes. Crokai and Huan Chi's shadow moved through the desolation of the chaos wastes, their bodies scarred, battered, and weighed down by the deaths of their kin. The Ouroboros of Eternity was in their possession, pulsing with an otherworldly light, its power still too vast to comprehend, its glyphs shifting endlessly as if whispering secrets they could not yet understand. Chaku had given his life to protect it. Tets had fallen, as a warrior should. And now only 2 remained. "We must find a way out of this cursed land," Crokai rumbled, his voice filled with quiet fury, his wounds still seeping, his massive frame weighted with exhaustion. Huan Chi's shadow merely nodded, his golden eyes flicking across the twisted horizon, scanning for anything that was not death, not chaos, not another nightmare waiting to devour them. Then, in the distance, they saw it. A city, half buried in the blackened sands, its once grand temples and pyramids sinking into a vast yawning abyss, swallowed by a void of endless darkness. Its stone was old, ancient beyond reckoning, its glyphs still glowing faintly with the power of the old ones, untouched by daemonic corruption. A sanctuary, or a grave. They had no choice but to enter. The city beneath the dust. As they approached, the ground trembled, the very foundations of the city cracking and groaning, great slabs of obsidian and jade crumbling into the ever-hungry void below. Time had not been kind to this place. It had been forgotten, abandoned in the wake of some ancient catastrophe, its priests long dead, its people swallowed by the abyss. Yet despite the decay, the architecture was unmistakable. This had once been a Slan temple city, a place where the Old Ones had once walked among their creations, where prophecies had been written, and where the will of the gods had once shaped the world. But now it was falling into nothingness. Crokai and Huan Chi moved quickly, their footsteps echoing through the ruined streets, past fallen obelisks, through collapsed courtyards, the very air filled with the scent of dust, damp stone, and something older than time itself. The city had been dead for centuries, yet something waited for them here. The heart of the ruins. They reached the central ziggurat, its steps cracked and weathered, yet its peak still glowing faintly, as if some power still lingered, fighting against the entropy of the wastes. Inside, the chamber was untouched, preserved by an invisible will, a single shrine standing in defiance of decay. At its center, resting upon a pedestal of solid gold, lay an artifact. It was unlike anything they had ever seen. A disk of shimmering light, its surface constantly shifting, showing visions of stars, of places distant, of paths yet traveled. A wayfinder of the Old Ones. A device of teleportation. Crokai stepped forward, his massive claws brushing against the ancient metal, and the moment he touched it, the glyphs upon its surface ignited, filling the room with an ethereal hum. Huan Chi tensed, his instincts screaming that something was wrong. Then, the ground split open. The city was giving way. The sinking of the past. A deep, terrible groan filled the air, and the ziggurat lurched, stone collapsing inward, cracks spreading across the chamber walls, great chunks of obsidian tumbling into the endless void below. The city was dying, its final moments upon them. "We need to leave, now," Huan Chi hissed. Crokai gritted his fangs, gripping the wayfinder, feeling its power pulsing, surging through his veins, the very force of the Old Ones threatening to tear him apart. The city shook violently, entire structures collapsing, ancient bridges crumbling into dust as the abyss yawned wider, consuming history itself. They had moments left. The wayfinder activated, its glyphs flashing brilliantly, revealing a vision of a place beyond the wastes, a land still touched by order, still grounded in the mortal world. A way out. but the artifact was unstable. "Touch it, we must go," Krokai roared. Quan Chi hesitated only a moment, his golden eyes flicking toward the sinking ruins, knowing that this place, one of the last remnants of their people's great history, would soon be lost forever. Then he moved, his claws brushing against the Wayfinder's glowing surface. And reality split apart. The leap through time and space. A blinding surge of light erupted from the artifact, swallowing them whole, warping the very fabric of existence, pulling them from the dying ruins into the unknown. For a moment they were nowhere and everywhere. Visions flooded their minds. The jungles of Lustria, untouched and vast. The old world, burning with war. The future, unwritten. And then, impact. They hit solid ground, tumbling onto damp soil, the scent of fresh air and storm clouds filling their lungs. They were no longer in the chaos wastes. The sky was real, the earth was whole, the taint of chaos was weakened, distant. They had escaped. Quan Chi exhaled, his body still thrumming from the journey, his senses struggling to adjust. Krokai groaned, his massive form rolling onto his back, the Wayfinder still clutched in his bloodied hands, its glow now dim, its energy spent. "Where are we?" Quan Chi stood, scanning the horizon, the distant peaks of mountains, the rushing sound of a great river, the flickering lights of a human settlement in the far distance. "We are close to the old world." He turned to the Ouroboros, still pulsing with unfathomable power, still radiating the will of the Old Ones, the artifact they had bled for, suffered for, lost everything for. The journey is not over. They had escaped the chaos wastes, but the war had not ended. The Ouroboros still had a purpose, and now they had to decide what to do with it. Chapter 24. The Great Betrayal. The road through Narska, a land of blood and ice. The Warband had escaped the chaos wastes, but the world was still against them. The Wayfinder's power was spent, its glow fading, leaving them stranded on the freezing plains of Norska, the land of marauders, raiders, and the endless servants of chaos. The air was sharp, biting with an unnatural cold, the landscape barren and merciless, filled with blackened pines and jagged cliffs, with nothing but the distant howl of wolves and the never-ending whispers of the northern gods. The Ouroboros of Eternity was still in their possession, its power burning beneath the surface, shifting gently in its own cosmic way, as though it knew what was coming next. Because the Warband was being hunted. The Warband of the Black Fang. They saw them first from the ridgeline, dark shapes emerging from the storm, moving with grim purpose. Norsemen, but not the mere marauders of the southern coast, not the fools who raided for plunder and glory. No. These were the Black Fang, a warband that had sworn themselves to chaos utterly, warriors marked by the gods, their bodies twisted by unholy blessings, their souls already forfeited to the great powers. Their leader, Skiarn the Bloodtaker, stood at the forefront, a giant even by Norscan standards, his flesh covered in jagged runes, his helmet adorned with the skull of a slain demon. His eyes gleamed with madness, his breath forming thick clouds of steam, his war axe already dripping with fresh blood. "Lizard things," he called, his voice a deep, guttural growl filled with malice and amusement alike. "You have wandered far from your jungle, but you carry something precious, something the gods want. Give it to us, and we may yet let you die with honor." Quan Chi's shadow said nothing, his golden eyes already measuring the battlefield, already calculating the best way to escape. Krokai snorted, his massive hands tightening into fists, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "You want it? Come and take it, human." The Black Fang roared, a chorus of war cries, their weapons gleaming in the cold light, their war dogs snapping at their chains, eager for flesh. "Kill them! The Ouroboros belongs to the gods." And then, the battle began. The battle in the snow. The Norse warriors charged, their iron boots thundering through the frost, their war cries shaking the trees, their weapons raised high, ready to rip the warband apart. Hunchi vanished into the storm, his form blurring, his daggers flashing out from the shadows, striking into the exposed flesh of the first raiders, slicing tendons, arteries, leaving bodies twitching in the snow. Krokai met the charge head-on, his war maul smashing into the first wave of attackers, sending limbs flying, shattering skulls, his roars drowning out the wails of the dying. A Noskan berserker lunged, his rune-etched sword slashing toward Krokai's throat. The Kroxigor caught the blade in his bare hands, his claws crushing the steel before he wrapped his massive fingers around the warrior's throat and ripped his head from his shoulders in a single, brutal motion. The snow ran red. The battle was fierce, but the warband was outnumbered, the Black Fang's warriors relentless, their ferocity unmatched. And then Huanchi saw it. A second wave of Norskins, flanking them from both sides, their shields raised, their spears gleaming, cutting off the only route of escape. They were trapped. Krokai gritted his teeth, stepping forward, his massive form blocking the only path between the mountains, the only chance the warband had to flee. He turned to Huanchi, his golden eyes calm, resolved. "Go, get the Ouroboros out of here." Huanchi stiffened, his claws twitching. "No. We fight together." Krokai shook his head, stepping forward, his broad shoulders rolling, his bloodied war maul resting across his massive back. "You are fast, faster than me. You can get out of here. I will hold them." Huanchi opened his mouth to argue. Then he saw it. The Norskins had begun chanting, their runes burning brighter, their weapons glowing with eldritch fire. This was no ordinary warband. This was a sacrificial force, their bodies already dedicated to the gods, their deaths nothing more than a ritual to empower whatever nightmare they served. They were not meant to win. They were meant to stall, to ensure the Ouroboros never left these lands. If they stayed, they would all die. And Krokai knew it. The last stand of Krokai. The Kroxigor turned, stepping into the gap between the cliffs, positioning himself as a living wall, his massive bulk blocking the path, his maul resting against his shoulder. "I have fought many battles, Huanchi, but this is the first I will fight alone." The Norskins charged, their weapons raised, their war cries filling the frozen air. Krokai roared back and met them head-on. Huanchi did not stay to watch. He turned, sprinting into the darkness, the Ouroboros clutched in his hands, his body disappearing into the storm, his heart burning with fury. Behind him, the sounds of slaughter filled the night. The thunder of Krokai's war maul, the crushing of bones, the roars of the dying, the defiant battle cries of a warrior who had never known fear. One by one, the Norskins fell, their bodies torn apart, crushed, broken, their blood painting the ice. But for every warrior he slew, more came. For every strike he landed, another blade found his flesh. But he did not fall easily. Krokai fought until his arms were too weak to lift his weapon. He fought until his body was drenched in blood, his own and that of his enemies. He fought until he was surrounded by corpses, the snow black with death, his breath ragged, heavy, his strength fading. And then he stood one last time, his body broken, his golden eyes blazing. "Come, then, if you dare." The final Murskin raised his axe, and the world went silent. A warrior's end. Huanchi did not stop running. He did not look back. He did not need to. He knew what had happened. Krokai had died a warrior's death, but the Ouroboros was still safe, and the last survivor of the warband was not finished yet. The old world was ahead, and so was the final leg of his journey. Chapter 25. The Empire's Pursuit. The Old World, a land of suspicion and fire. The Old World stretched before him, its land still drenched in the ever-present stench of war, fear, and steel. Juan's shadow moved like a specter, the Ouroboros of Eternity wrapped tightly in his grasp, its golden glyphs pulsing softly, whispering to him in a language older than time itself. His body was scarred and weary, his mind frayed by loss, but he did not stop. He could not stop. Rokai was gone. Chaku was gone. Xol'taq was gone. He was the last survivor of the Warband, the final keeper of the Ouroboros, and the Old One's will still demanded completion. But the Empire had already seen him. The hunters had been set loose, and they would not stop until he was dead. The Sigmarite Inquisition, the first encounter. It began with the ringing of bells, the distant sound of a warning horn, the unmistakable clang of armored boots, the murmurs of soldiers whispering prayers to Sigmar. Juan had been spotted near the edges of an imperial settlement, a place of tall wooden palisades and spiked defenses, its watchtowers filled with eagle-eyed soldiers sworn to burn anything touched by chaos. And to them he was no different from the monsters they had fought for centuries. The first crossbow bolts screamed through the air, embedding into the tree beside him, their steel tips quivering from the force of the shot. "Lizard thing, stand down. In Sigmar's name, surrender." Juan vanished into the mist. The Sigmarites cursed, their voices laced with hatred and fear, their torches flaring against the evening gloom, their warhounds snarling as they picked up his scent. "Hunted down. We will not suffer the filth of the serpent god in our lands. It is chaos born. Kill it before it spreads its corruption." Juan's golden eyes narrowed, his breathing steady, his body melting into the underbrush, waiting. There were 10 of them, too many to fight head-on. Steel-plated warriors, their chests adorned with purity seals, their weapons blessed and sharpened to cut through the flesh of witches and heretics alike. They moved cautiously, their faith strong, their fear of the unknown buried beneath their duty to Sigmar. But Juan had fought greater foes than these. He had killed in the darkness before. He would do it again. The shadows strike. The first soldier never saw the blade. Juan moved with ghostly precision, his dagger sliding between the gaps in the man's gorget, slicing deep into his throat, severing the jugular, cutting off the scream before it could escape his lips. The body fell into the mud, its armor clanking softly, the pool of blood spreading slowly, hidden by the dense foliage. The others only realized too late. What was that? Where is Eric? Eric, Sigmar's light, where? A second blade found its home, this time in the armpit of another warrior. Juan's form blurring past the torchlight, the Imperial soldier's armor failing him in his final moments. Ambush. It's here. Juan moved again, dodging a wild swing of a longsword, his form twisting, his tail lashing out, knocking the soldier off balance, before a final plunge of his dagger sent him crashing to the earth, blood pouring from his chest. "Sigmar, protect us." The remaining Sigmarites panicked, their discipline breaking, their faith wavering as the jungle night devoured them, one by one. By the time the last soldier was left standing, his breathing ragged, his eyes wild with fear, his torch flickering, he fell to his knees, muttering prayers, clutching his hammer to his chest. "I will not die in darkness. I will not die in darkness. I will not." Juan's dagger found his spine. The final body collapsed, and the forest fell silent once more. But the Empire was not the only threat, for another army had seen the battle, and this one was not as easily broken. The Bretonnian host. The distant thunder of hooves rolled through the valley, the sound of war horses charging, of lances being lowered, of knights adorned in the heraldry of their noble houses preparing to strike down a monstrous foe. There the beast stands among its slaughter, cut it down, avenge the fallen men of the Empire. Bretonnians, noble knights, oath-bound warriors of honor and duty. But to Huan Qi, they were just another enemy, another wall of steel and fanaticism that refused to understand that he was not chaos-born, that he was not their foe. And they would not listen to reason. The first knight charged, his lance gleaming in the moonlight, his warhorse thundering forward, his battle cry ringing like a clarion call across the battlefield. Huan Qi's eyes flickered coldly, his instincts kicking in. One chance, one moment. He sidestepped at the last possible second, his dagger flashing outward, slicing deep into the exposed thigh of the rider, severing muscle, tendons, and arteries in one precise movement. The horse screamed, its rider tumbling from the saddle, his body slamming into the dirt, bones shattering on impact. The second knight came harder, faster, his blade flashing downward in a killing arc. Huan Qi rolled beneath the strike, using the knight's momentum against him, leaping onto the steed's flank, his daggers burying into the exposed neck of the warhorse, twisting, spilling its lifeblood across the battlefield. The horse collapsed, sending the rider crashing into a tree, his helm cracking open, his body falling limp. More knights surrounded him, circling like wolves, preparing for the final strike. For the lady, for Britannia, this creature shall not defile our lands. Huan Qi knew he could not fight them all. His daggers were sharp, but they would not break through enchanted plate. His body was fast, but he would not outrun an army of warhorses on open ground. The Ouroboros pulsed in his grasp, its energy whispering, showing him a path unseen. There was only one way out. He had to disappear. One chance, one moment. Huan Qi threw a vial from his belt, a cloud of alchemical smoke exploding in the air, blinding the knights, throwing them into disarray. And then he vanished into the night. The Britannians cursed, their voices ringing with fury, their warhorses rearing, but their enemy was already gone, lost to the shadows and the wilds beyond. But Huan Qi knew one thing for certain. The old world would never stop hunting him. And the war for the Oroborus was far from over. Chapter 26. The Return Home. The Shores of Lustria. A homecoming tainted by chaos. The journey had been long. Through the hellscape of the chaos wastes, through the carnage of Norska, through the fanatical pursuit of the Empire and Britannia, Huan Qi had never stopped moving. The Ouroboros of Eternity had guided him, its power whispering unseen paths, allowing him to slip past hunters, armies, and curses alike. But now, at last, he stood upon the deck of a ship, watching as the mist parted, revealing Lustria's endless jungles. Yet, something was wrong. As the ocean waves crashed against the hull, as the humid jungle air filled his lungs, Huan Qi felt it, the presence of something watching him. Even here, even at the very threshold of his homeland, chaos was still near. The jungle's whisper. The ship anchored just beyond the brackish waters, where the green walls of Lustria's jungle loomed, its vines and trees twisting into an impenetrable fortress. Huan Qi stepped onto the sand, his feet sinking slightly into the warm earth, his golden eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. Something was wrong. There was no welcoming cry of the jungle birds, no movement in the trees, no chittering of insects or rustling of hidden beasts. Lustria was never silent. But tonight, it was deathly still. Kai would have grunted in suspicion. Chaku would have felt it immediately, muttering prayers to the Old Ones. Xol'taq would have raised his weapon and prepared for war. But Huan Qi was alone now, and the silence was his only companion. The gods still watch. Huan Qi took the Ouroboros from his satchel, feeling its pulse, the ancient glyphs shifting beneath his fingers, their meanings ever-changing, slipping between the past and the future. Was it done? Was the mission complete? But a whisper. It did not come from the trees. It did not come from the winds. It came from inside his mind. You think you have won. You think you are safe, but the game has only just begun. Huanshi's scales bristled, his body tensing, his daggers already half drawn. But there was nothing there. No enemy, no beast. Only the oppressive weight of something vast and unseen, a gaze that stretched beyond time itself. The Chaos Gods were still watching. The taint in Lustria. The jungle's silence was broken by a sound, a low, deep vibration, something unholy, something wrong. Huanshi's eyes snapped to the trees, and he saw it. Corruption. The jungle, once a sacred domain of the Old Ones, bore tainted scars, its trees blackened and withered, their bark cracking open, revealing veins of pulsing, molten flesh. The ground swelled and twisted, shifting unnaturally, the vines squirming like living things, their ends tipped with tiny, gnashing mouths. Not here. Huanshi took a step back, his mind racing. This was not Lustria's natural cycle. This was chaos, lingering, clawing, waiting to take hold. The Ouroboros burned hot in his grip, reacting to the taint, its power resisting, its ancient magic pushing back against the creeping filth. They are still here. Even in Lustria, the dark gods have not abandoned their claim. And then, from the depths of the jungle, a shadow moved. The Touched Ones. Emerging from the undergrowth came a figure, hunched and writhing, its body twisted by mutation, its scales marred with black veins, its once golden eyes now filled with the sickly glow of chaos taint. It had once been a skink priest, but now it was something else. Its hands, once meant for ritual and prayer, now twitched with uncontrolled spasms, its voice a wet gurgle, a sound that belonged to no living thing. Behind it others came, skinks, saurus, warriors who had once served the Old Ones, now crawling with corruption, their flesh warping, their mouths mumbling prayers to something that should not be prayed to. Huanshi's daggers were in his hands before he could even think. Lustria belongs to the Old Ones. You do not. The tainted skinks merely twitched, their bodies contorting, their eyes flickering with unnatural light. The Old Ones are gone, but the gods remain. The great changer, the all-seeing one, he who writes destiny. He has already won. The Oroborus is his. Our corona dostik. Huanshi's blood ran cold. This was no mere infestation. This was a foothold. Chaos had already infiltrated Lustria, and they knew of the Ouroboros. And they had been waiting for him. The first blood. Huanshi did not wait. His first dagger flew, embedding deep into the skull of the lead skink, his body twitching violently before collapsing into the jungle floor, black blood oozing from its wound. The others lunged. The jungle erupted into a frenzy of violence. Huanshi's blades flashing, slicing through the corrupted, severing tainted flesh, carving through limbs that pulsed with unholy life. A clawed hand lashed out, nearly tearing into his throat, but Huanshi rolled beneath the strike, his tail whipping forward, sending his attacker crashing into the rotting undergrowth. "You are nothing but shadows of what you once were," he hissed. They shrieked in response, their bodies breaking apart, warping even as they died, their very forms held together by the will of something far greater than themselves. The jungle groaned, the trees swaying as if alive, as if the very land itself was resisting, as if Lustria still fought against the corruption creeping into its heart. Huanshi knew he could not stay here. This was not a battle to be won. This was a warning. If chaos had already infiltrated Lustria, then the Ouroboros was in greater danger than ever before. They have come for it. They know what it is, and they will not stop until they claim it for themselves. Huanshi's eyes narrowed, his heart pounding. Then I must not stop either. The journey continues. The last of the corrupted skinks fell, their forms finally motionless, their blackened ichor staining the jungle floor. Juan stood over them, his breath steady, his blades dripping with blood. The silence returned. But it was not the peaceful silence of Lustria. It was the silence of a world holding its breath. The Chaos Gods were still watching. Juan turned away from the corpses, gripping the Ouroboros tightly, feeling its heat against his chest. There was no time to waste. He had to reach the remaining Slan Mage-Priests. He had to warn them, because chaos was already here, and Lustria was no longer safe. Chapter 27. A Last Stand at Xoltan. The Temple City of Xoltan. The Last Bastion. Juan's shadow moved swiftly through the deep jungles of Lustria, the Ouroboros of Eternity clutched tightly in his claws, its glyphs burning hot, whispering warnings in a language older than time itself. Xoltan was just ahead, a temple city still standing, still defying the tides of corruption, its golden pyramids looming above the jungle canopy, its great causeways lined with watchful stone sentinels, its walls etched with the will of the old ones. But even before he reached the gates, he knew something was wrong. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of sulfur, ash, and something worse. The jungle around the city trembled, its vines wilting, its trees blackened by unseen rot. Xoltan was under siege. Chaos has come, and it was already inside the walls. The invasion of the demon host. As Juan entered the stone causeways, he found them littered with the bodies of the fallen Sorcerer warriors, their great crested helms cracked, their armor shattered, their spears slick with blood. The gates were still open, but the streets were silent. No drums of war, no chanting skink priests, only the flickering glow of sorcery, the low hum of something ancient and hungry. Then he saw it. At the heart of Xoltan, near the Great Pyramid, a rift had been torn open, a gaping wound in reality itself, its edges searing with unnatural light, warp fire spilling outward like a flood, devouring the city's sacred stones. And from that abyss it stepped forward. The demon host, the beast from the warp. It was twisted beyond comprehension, a fusion of flesh and nightmare, its limbs shifting, sprouting clawed hands and talons, its face a mask of ever-changing forms, each one a tormented echo of the souls it had devoured. Its body radiated corruption, its very presence causing the earth to decay, its every step warping the ancient glyphs that once protected the city. The Ouroboros burned in Juan's grip, reacting to the abomination's presence, the ancient artifact's power flaring in defiance. The demon host turned, and it saw him. Lizard thing, keeper of the Ouroboros, you cannot run. Its voice was a chorus of screams, overlapping in unnatural harmony, the voices of all those it had consumed, all those it had replaced with its ever-growing form. Give it to me, and I will make your death painless. Juan snarled, his daggers flashing into his hands. Come and take it, filth. The demon host laughed, its form splitting apart, tendrils of warp energy lashing outward, coiling toward him like serpents of living fire. But before they could strike, a thunderous roar erupted from the temple steps. For the old ones, for Xoltan, the Lizardmen were not broken. They were ready to die. The final stand of the Lizardmen. A tide of Sorcerer warriors surged forward, their obsidian-tipped spears gleaming, their bodies covered in the blood of their fallen kin, but their eyes filled with nothing but fury. The demon host turned, its laughter distorting into something else, frustration, rage, surprise. The warriors of Xoltan had not fallen quietly, and they would not fall now. Kill it, purge it from our land. The first wave of Sorcerers crashed into the abomination, their weapons driving deep, their roars deafening, their sheer strength enough to shatter mortal armies. The demon host shrieked, its body writhing, lashing out with clawed hands, tentacles of pure warp fire tearing through the ranks, ripping limbs from bodies, crushing skulls like ripe fruit. But the Saurus did not stop. One by one they died, but not before wounding the beast, not before dragging it down, piece by piece, limb by limb. And then came the Temple Guard, the guardians of the Old Ones. The gates of the Great Pyramid opened, and from within the Temple Guard emerged, their bodies adorned in gold, their weapons charged with the divine might of the Slan. "We are the last. We will hold the gates. None shall pass." They charged, their halberds crashing against the demon host, their formations unyielding, their movements flawless, each strike carving away more of the monster's twisted form. The demon host faltered, its laughter turning to screams, its body shrinking, losing its stolen strength, its connection to the warp weakening under the unrelenting fury of the Lizardmen. Juan saw his moment. He leapt forward, the Ouroboros burning white-hot, its glyphs now fully awakened, pulsing with the will of the Old Ones. "You do not belong here. This world is not yours." With a final, desperate strike, he slammed the Ouroboros against the demon host's chest, the artifact's energy piercing into its core, unraveling the chaos that bound it together. The demon host convulsed, its form imploding, tendrils snapping inward, its screams rising into a howling cacophony. And then, with a final explosion of white fire, it was gone. The rift snapped shut, sealing the tear in reality, the air clear once more. And Xoltan, though wounded, still stood. The aftermath. Juan fell to his knees, the Ouroboros still humming in his grasp, its power finally dormant, its whispers silent. The surviving Saurus warriors stood amidst the carnage, their breath ragged, their weapons slick with demon blood, their city saved, but at a terrible cost. The Temple Guard bowed, their leader stepping forward. "You carry the will of the Old Ones, Hunter. You have brought the Ouroboros home, and Xoltan will stand because of you." Juan said nothing, his eyes scanning the ruined streets, the bodies of the fallen, the smoldering remnants of the battle. They had won. But chaos would return. It always did. And next time, there may not be anyone left to stop it. For now, though, the Ouroboros was safe. For now, Lustria still stood. And that was enough. Chapter 28. The Slan's Judgment. Xoltan. The Awakening of a God. The temple city of Xoltan still stood, though it was drenched in blood and ruin, its once pristine avenues littered with the corpses of fallen Saurus warriors and the shattered remains of demonic horrors. The air reeked of burnt flesh, sorcery, and death, and the very stones of the Great Pyramid trembled with the echoes of the battle. Uache's shadow stood in the midst of the carnage, his body aching from wounds unseen, his golden eyes scanning the battlefield. They had won. The demon host was destroyed, its body reduced to nothing, its influence torn from this world by the power of the Ouroboros of Eternity. But the war was not over. Something deeper still lingered in the air, something vast, ancient, and patient, watching. Something stirring beneath the city. And then, it happened. The heavens darkened, the sky twisting into unnatural patterns, the stars aligning into glyphs unseen for thousands of years. The air hummed with raw energy, sending shivers through the scales of every living thing, an invisible force pressing upon their very souls, a feeling of divine purpose unfolding. Then, the Great Pyramid of Xoltan split open, and Xol'taq, the Slann Mage-Priest, rose from his slumber. The Slan awakens. For centuries untold, Xol'taq had remained in deep meditation, his mortal form nearly forgotten, his mind adrift in the great plan, bound to the will of the Old Ones beyond time itself. But today he returned to the world. His body, levitating above the golden dais, was immense. his flesh layered with sacred glyphs that pulsed with celestial energy, his eyes glowing with the wisdom of ages. Though his form had once been frail, ancient, near mummified, he was now something greater, his body wreathed in an aura of raw, cosmic might, his presence bending the very fabric of reality around him. He was no longer simply Xol'taq, a Slann Mage-Priest of Xoltan. He was the will of the Old Ones made manifest, and chaos had trespassed upon his domain. The taint must be cleansed. His voice was not spoken, but rather etched into the fabric of existence itself, reverberating through the temple, the city, the jungle beyond, its sheer force cracking the foundations of reality. The remaining warriors of Xoltan fell to their knees in awe and reverence, their weapons trembling in their hands, their souls overwhelmed by the presence of the godlike entity before them. Juan's shadow, the last of the warband that had retrieved the Ouroboros, stood firm, his golden eyes locking onto the Slan, his body braced against the surge of overwhelming energy. He had seen warriors break under lesser things, but he had never seen the sky itself bend in submission, and Xol'taq had only just begun. The spell of unmaking. The Slan raised a single hand, his three-fingered palm glowing with an impossible radiance, a power that had not been wielded in an age of the world. And the jungle itself obeyed. The ground split open, revealing the ley lines of the world, rivers of pure celestial energy that had long been buried beneath time, their paths dictated by the hand of the Old Ones themselves. The glyphs on the city's pyramids ignited, their ancient runes shining like miniature suns, their power aligning with Xol'taq's will. The Old Ones do not suffer the imp. And then he spoke the final words of power, a spell that had been forbidden since the days of the Great Catastrophe, a word of unmaking. And the world screamed. The banishment of chaos. The shockwave erupted from Xol'taq's form, an unleashing of celestial devastation, a force so pure, so absolute, that reality itself recoiled in its wake. The sky split apart, the jungle quaked, the rivers ran in reverse, as the very air became saturated with the will of the Old Ones. And the remnants of chaos, the tainted, the corrupted, the lingering filth left behind, burned. Across Xoltan, the last surviving chaos-tainted creatures shrieked in agony, their bodies igniting with blue-white fire, their souls unmade, their very existence erased from the mortal plane. The jungle's twisted corruption unraveled, the blackened trees restored, the land healing itself under the sheer force of divine magic. Even beyond Xoltan's walls, echoes of the spell rang out, rippling through the wilderness of Lustria, cleansing pockets of hidden rot, breaking demonic rituals, sending lesser creatures of chaos fleeing back into the shadows where they belong. Let the vermin of the warp know this world is not theirs to claim. And then it was done. The spell's energy faded, leaving behind only silence. A silence that felt whole, no longer infected by the whispers of the enemy, no longer stained by tainted breath or blasphemous sorcery. For the first time in an age, Xoltan was cleansed. The aftermath. Juan stood amidst the ruins of battle, his body aching, his mind heavy, the Ouroboros now cold in his grasp, its power finally dormant. The war had been won, but his mission was not over. Xol'taq turned his vast, unblinking eyes toward him, the gaze of an entity that had seen eternity and survived it. You have done what none before you have accomplished, Hunter. The Ouroboros is where it belongs. Juan said nothing, simply bowing his head in silent reverence. Xol'taq raised a hand, and in a single instant Juan felt the weight of his journey lift, his wounds sealed, his exhaustion banished. You have earned your place among the stars. The skies above Xoltan cleared, the last remnants of chaos driven from the land. The will of the Old Ones reaffirmed. And yet, Far beyond the jungles, in the dark places of the world, the gods of chaos still watched. This was only one battle. The war for Lustria, for the Old One's great plan, for existence itself, was far from over. But for now, for this moment, Xoltan stood. And Wanchi's war was done. Chapter 29. The Price of Victory. Xoltan. The aftermath of war. The battle was over, but victory never came without sacrifice. The temple city of Xoltan still stood, its golden pyramids bathed in the flickering glow of cleansing flames, the remnants of chaos and corruption burned away by Xoltaq's divine wrath. Yet, even as the enemy was banished, the toll of the war could not be undone. The dead littered the sacred avenues, their lifeless eyes staring at the sky, warriors who had given their last breath in service of the Old Ones. But it was not only the city that had suffered. The Warband, the ones who had retrieved the Ouroboros of Eternity, who had bled and fought across the chaos wastes through the Empire, Norska, and beyond, was now reduced to a single survivor, and even he would soon be gone. Xoltaq's final moments. The Saurus old blood had never feared death. He had fought for centuries, an unbreakable warrior, a living weapon of the Old Ones. He had crushed Skaven hordes beneath his claws. He had battled demons under red skies, and he had bled against the greatest champions of chaos. But even he was not immortal. He lay at the foot of the Great Pyramid, his massive body broken, his armor dented and split, his scales dark with dried blood. Wanchi stood beside him, silent. "We won." Xoltaq's breathing was labored, his golden eyes flickering, yet there was no fear, no hesitation. Only acceptance. Victory always demands a price. His fingers clenched weakly, the last remnants of his strength failing him, his mighty chest rising and falling, slower and slower. The war never ends, Skink, but this fight is done. Wanchi nodded, saying nothing. Xoltaq had been the Warband's rock, the one who had led them through the horrors of chaos, through the fires of war, through the edge of oblivion. Now he was leaving it behind. I go, to the Old Ones now, or to the void. Either way it matters not. A long breath, a final exhale. Then stillness. Xoltaq, the mightiest warrior of their kind, was gone, and the world would never know his name. Chaku's soul is lost forever. The winds stirred, the remnants of Xoltaq's great banishment spell still lingering in the air, the very fabric of Lustria itself shifting, resisting the taint that had tried to take root here. And for a moment, Wanchi could swear he heard a voice. It was faint, so faint that it could have been the wind or a memory, or something far worse. But he knew. It was Chaku, the skink priest who had given his soul to stop the greater demon, the one who had held the line at the cost of his own existence, the one who had never faltered in his faith, even when the Old Ones had been silent. Yet now, as the spell's last remnants faded, there was no trace of him. No spirit returning to the stars. No presence lingering near the temple's sacred altars. Nothing. The Old Ones do not save all of us. Wanchi clenched his fists. Chaku had given everything, but his reward had been oblivion. There was no afterlife for him. No celestial halls. Just nothing. And that thought was more terrible than any war Wanchi had ever fought. Wanchi's shadow vanishes. The ceremony of the dead began. The surviving temple guard gathered, their golden masks shining in the firelight, their blades lifted in silent honor of the fallen. Xoltaq's body was carried to the sacred pools, where his remains would be offered to the jungle, to be reborn as part of the great cycle. But Wanchi did not stay to watch. He had done what he was meant to do. The Oroborus was safe. Lustria still stood. The Warband was gone. And he had no place here anymore. So, without a word, without a single glance back, Juan vanished into the jungle, his form swallowed by the mist, his presence fading into the endless wilderness of Lustria. No one followed. No one called his name. By the time dawn broke across the horizon, he was gone, and his fate would forever remain unknown. The end of the Warband. The Ouroboros of Eternity rested within the temple's heart, untouched, uncorrupted. The Chaos Gods had been denied their prize, but their eyes would never stop searching. The Old Ones remained silent, as they always did, and the ones who had bled, fought, and died for this artifact were now nothing but names lost to time. Xol'taq, dead, his legend forgotten. Chaku, erased from existence, his soul scattered to nothingness. Grokayai, slain in Noska, buried beneath enemy corpses. Zanchai, betrayer and fallen, cut down by his own kind. Juan's shadow vanished, his fate uncertain. And yet, as the jungle winds blew through the silent avenues of Xoltan, as the sacred temple stood defiant against time, a new war was already stirring beyond the horizon. The Chaos Gods never gave up. Their plans never ended. The Ouroboros was safe, for now. But Lustria's war would never end. And somewhere, deep within the endless jungle, a single golden-eyed hunter watched from the shadows, waiting for the day when he would be needed again. Chapter 30. The Stars Align Once More. Xoltan. The will of the Old Ones. The battle had ended, but the war was never truly over. The Ouroboros of Eternity now rested deep within the vaults of Xoltan, pulsing softly with forgotten power, its glyphs shifting in ways even the Slan could not fully comprehend. The artifact was safe, for now, but even as the sun rose over the ruined city, even as the last embers of the great battle cooled, even as the blood of fallen warriors dried upon sacred stone, one truth remained unshaken. Chaos would return. It always did. And so, exalted, the last Slan of Xoltan made his final decree. The Slan's final words. The air was still, charged with the remnants of celestial power, the temple's walls vibrating with unseen energy as the mighty Slan hovered above the great dais, his form wreathed in golden light, his eyes half-lidded in ancient wisdom. The surviving priests of the city knelt before him, their bodies bowed in reverence, their faces etched with exhaustion and awe. The temple guards stood unmoving, their halberds crossed before their chests, their golden masks reflecting the morning light, silent as the final commandment was given. Xoltan's voice was not a whisper, nor was it a shout, it was simply known, a voice that echoed in the minds of all who heard it, as though it had always been there, as though it had always been spoken. The cycle endures. The great plan remains. Chaos has been denied its prize, but it will never be destroyed. The priests trembled, their frilled crests rising in silent acknowledgement, knowing that this was the way of things, that victory was never absolute, only temporary. In my time, I have seen the stars burn. I have seen the rise and fall of empires, the great works of the Old Ones crumble beneath the weight of war. But still, we endure. Still, we fight. He lifted his hand, and the temple's vast glyphs shimmered, their meaning now etched upon the very stone itself, an eternal record of this moment, a reminder of what had been done and what must always be done again. The Oroborus must never leave this place again. The priests bowed deeper, accepting the burden. This warband has fulfilled its purpose. Their duty is complete. Their names will be remembered, for they have done what no others have done. And yet, the stars align once more. The omens return, the shadow of chaos looms ever near. This was but a battle in a war that will never end. Xoltaq's eyes burned with celestial fire, and his final decree resounded through Xoltan like the last great roar of an ancient god. We shall slumber again, until we are needed once more. The Slan returns to his long sleep. The temple began to change, as though the very city itself understood what was happening, as though the stones remembered this cycle, as though they had done this many times before. Xol'taq hovered toward his throne, the vast golden seat of his ancestors, untouched by the passing of time. He lowered himself upon it, his massive form settling into the deep stillness of meditation, his eyes dimming, his breath becoming slow, steady, ageless. The glyphs upon his flesh pulsed, dimming with him, sinking once more with the will of the old ones, his consciousness drifting beyond mortal concerns, beyond war, beyond time itself. The priests stood in solemn silence, watching as their godlike master sealed himself away once more, his body frozen in a perfect state of contemplation, waiting, always waiting, for the day chaos would return, for the day the great plan would need him once more. The Slan was gone, and now it was up to the mortal children of the Old Ones to continue the war, the final fate of the Warband. The Ouroboros was secured, but those who had bled to return it home were gone. Tetzok, the indomitable Saris Oldblood, was dead, his body now one with the jungle, his name fading into legend, unspoken but never forgotten. Chaku, the faithful skink priest, had sacrificed his very soul to halt the demon, his existence now erased from history, forever lost in the great void beyond mortal understanding. Krokai, the unstoppable Kroxiger, had fallen in Norska, his final moments spent crushing the warriors of chaos, buying his kin the time they needed to survive. Zanchai, the skink star priest who fell to corruption, had been struck down by his own kind, his betrayal avenged in blood. And Huanchi's shadow, the last survivor of the Warband, the final remnant of their mission, had disappeared into the jungle, his fate unknown, his presence vanishing into myth. Some say he was still out there, a ghost in the trees, watching, waiting, ensuring that no hand, mortal or demonic, would ever touch the Ouroboros again. Others say he was simply gone, his body lost to the wilderness, his task fulfilled, his soul claimed by the endless cycle of the great plan. No one knew, and no one would ever know. The stars align once more. As the last of the priests left the great chamber, as the doors of the sacred vaults sealed themselves, a great stillness fell over Xoltan. The Slan slept once more. The Warband was no more. But far beyond the jungles, in the cold reaches of the world, in the dark places where the whispers of God still echoed, the Chaos God stirred once again. They had been denied the Ouroboros, but they had not been defeated. For chaos never dies, and somewhere in the twisting heavens above the constellations shifted, the sacred symbols of the Old Ones shifting in response. The great plan was not yet fulfilled. And one day, perhaps sooner than the Slan would hope, the stars would align once more, and war would come again.